Dear listeners, this channel publishes only full and exclusive audio stories. Please subscribe and like them if you enjoy them.
Chapter 1. The 11 o'clock silence. The fog came in off the harbor a little after 10, the way it did most nights, sliding up the bluff and through the streets until it pressed itself against the tall windows of the Aurelian like something trying to get warm. Julian Voss stood behind the concierge desk in the lobby and watched it gather around the street lamps outside, turning each one into a soft yellow bruise in the dark. He had worked the night shift at the Aurelian for 11 years, and in that time he had learned that the hotel had two faces. By day it was all polished brass and murmured pleasantries, bellhops moving like dancers around the marble columns, the lobby pianist working through Gershwin for an audience of businessmen checking their phones. But at night, after the last dinner reservation had been cleared and the bar had poured its final round, the Aurelian became something else. Quieter. Older. It breathed differently, the way a person breathes differently when they think no one is watching. Julian liked the night shift for exactly that reason. He liked watching the hotel exhale. "You're doing the thing again," said Priya, coming around the desk with a stack of folios under her arm. She was technically off shift, had been for 40 minutes, but she lingered most nights longer than she needed to, claiming paperwork. Julian suspected the real reason was that the apartment she shared with two roommates was loud, and the lobby, after midnight, was the only quiet place she had. What thing? The thing where you stare at the door, like it personally offended you. She set the folios down and followed his gaze toward the revolving entrance, empty now, glass catching the chandelier light. "There's nobody there, Julian." "I know there's nobody there." "Then why are you looking at it like that?" He didn't have a good answer, so he said nothing, which was generally his approach to questions he didn't have good answers for. Priya had learned, over the 2 years she'd worked under him, that his silences came in several varieties. There was the silence of disapproval, the silence of concentration, and the silence that meant he was turning something over in his mind that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. This, she suspected, was the third kind. "Suit yourself," she said, and went back to her folios. It was 11:42 when the call came down from the 7th floor about a noise complaint. Nothing unusual, a couple in 712 grumbling about footsteps above them. Julian took the call himself because that was the job, to be the person who absorbed the small frictions of the night so that guests never had to feel them. He told the couple he would look into it personally, and he meant it because he always meant it, because meaning it was the only way the lie of effortless service held together. He took the back stairwell instead of the elevator. He liked the stairwell at night. It ran up the spine of the building in a long, unbroken column, lit at each landing by a single brass sconce, and somewhere around the 9th floor there was a window, narrow, arched, original to the 1933 construction, that looked out across an interior light well toward the hotel's east wing. From certain angles, on certain floors, you could see directly into a sliver of the penthouse suite through that window, a gap in the curtains that housekeeping had never quite managed to close all the way, a flaw the hotel had lived with for as long as Julian had worked there. He didn't usually look. There was an unspoken rule among the staff, never written down but understood the way all the best hotel rules were understood. You do not see what isn't meant for you. Julian had built an entire career on that rule. He was, by his own private estimation, one of the best in the business at not seeing things. But that night, climbing past the 9th floor landing, something in the corner of his vision moved wrong, and his body stopped before his mind had finished deciding to stop it. Through the gap in the curtains, in the warm gold wash of the penthouse's interior lighting, he saw two figures. One was standing, The other was on the floor, and the standing figure had both hands wrapped around the other's throat, and even at this distance, even through glass and fog, and the unreliable witness of a narrow stairwell window at 1:45, Julian understood with total, sickening clarity what he was looking at. He didn't remember deciding to move. He remembered being at the 9th-floor landing and then being at the service door to the east wing, badge already in his hand, breath loud in his own ears in a way it almost never was. He remembered thinking, with the strange clinical detachment that sometimes arrives in genuine emergencies, that he should call security first and didn't, because there wasn't time, because by the time Augustine's people made it up from the basement office, whatever was happening in that room would already be finished. The penthouse was at the end of a short private corridor, accessible only by a separate elevator that required a key card Julian did, in fact, possess. One of the small, invisible privileges of seniority. He took the elevator because the corridor was too exposed for what he intended, and the elevator was excruciatingly, achingly slow, rising through the building's spine while his pulse hammered against his collar. When the doors opened, the corridor was empty. Soft carpet, recessed lighting, the particular hush of money. He went to the penthouse door and knocked 3 times hard, with the flat of his hand instead of his knuckles, the way you knock when you need someone to know you mean it. There was a pause. A long one, long enough that Julian's mind began constructing the next several minutes. Calling Augustine, calling the police, the particular silence that would fall over the lobby when the patrol cars arrived, the headline this would become, the hotel's careful century of discretion undone in a single shift. Then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps 50, heavy-set, dressed in an open-collared shirt with a glass of something amber in one hand. He looked, Julian registered with a kind of vertigo, entirely fine. Flushed, slightly, the way a man looks after a hot shower or a second drink, but fine. Breathing normally. Throat unmarked. "Can I help you?" the man said, in the particular tone of someone who has been interrupted and is deciding whether to be annoyed about it. "Sir." Julian's voice came out steadier than he expected, which was either a credit to 11 years of training or evidence that some part of him had already begun rewriting what he'd seen. "I apologize for the intrusion. We received a noise complaint from a lower floor, and I wanted to check in personally and make sure everything was all right up here." The man, Julian would learn his name was Desmond Achterberg within the hour, though it meant nothing to him yet, looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost, but not quite, amused. "Everything's fine," he said. "I was watching television. Apologize to whoever complained. I'll keep it down." "Of course. Thank you, sir." The door closed. Julian stood in the hallway for several seconds, listening to his own pulse, and then, because he had spent his entire adult life being a person who checked things twice, he asked, quietly, if he might come in and confirm there wasn't an issue with the room itself, a leak, an electrical concern, something that might explain a disturbance. It was a flimsy pretext, and he knew it was flimsy even as he offered it, but Achterberg, after a beat, shrugged and stepped back from the door.
"Sure."
"Knock yourself out." The penthouse suite was spotless. Not tidy, spotless, in the particular way that suggested either nothing had happened in it at all or that something had happened and been very thoroughly erased. The carpet showed the faint parallel lines of a recent vacuuming. The bed was made with hospital precision. There was a single glass on the side table, identical to the one in Achterberg's hand, and nothing else. No second glass, no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle, no second person. "Find what you were looking for?" Achterberg asked, and there was something underneath the mild irritation in his voice now, something sharper, watching Julian a half-second too closely. "Yes, sir. My apologies again for the disturbance." Julian's eyes moved, once, fast, toward the far wall. A long ornamental panel of dark walnut paneling that ran from floor to ceiling beside the bar, the kind of architectural detail original to a building this old, the kind of thing nobody looked at twice. He didn't know why his attention caught there. He filed it away, the way he filed away every small wrongness in a day built entirely out of small wrongnesses, and left. He didn't sleep that night, though his shift technically ended at 6. He went home to his small apartment 3 blocks from the hotel, sat on the edge of his bed in the gray early light, and tried to explain to himself, calmly and rationally, what he had seen. He had not imagined it. He was almost entirely certain he had not imagined it. He had seen 2 figures, one standing, one on the floor, hands at a throat. He had seen it through fog and glass and at a steep angle and for perhaps 4 seconds, and 4 seconds was not very long, and angles could deceive, and the human eye, presented with an ambiguous shape in low light, was a notoriously unreliable narrator. But he had also, 11 years into a career built on noticing things other people missed, never once been wrong about something like this. Not once. He didn't know how to hold both of those facts in his hands at the same time. He thought, too, about the glass. Achterberg Scotch, neat, no ice, in a heavy rocks glass with a faceted base. The same order, down to the type of glass and the absence of ice, that a different guest, a thin, nervous woman whose name he couldn't immediately recall, had placed 3 months earlier from this same suite, in this same week of the month. It was a strange thing to notice in the middle of what should have been the most frightening night of his professional life, and it bothered him more than the fear did, because fear at least made sense. He returned to work the following evening at the usual hour, and the hotel was, on the surface, exactly as it always was. The lobby smelled of cut lilies and brass polish. The pianist was working through a slow, melancholy arrangement of something French that Julian had never learned the name of in 11 years of hearing it. Priya was at the desk already, 15 minutes early, which told him she'd heard something. "You look terrible," she said, by way of greeting. "Thank you. I mean it. What happened?" He hesitated. There was a version of this conversation where he said nothing, filed the previous night away as an aberration, a trick of fog and fatigue, and let the Aurelian go on being the kind of place where nothing ever happened that wasn't meant to happen. There was another version where he told her everything and risked making himself, in her eyes and eventually in everyone else's, the night concierge who'd had some sort of episode on shift. He chose a third version, the one in between, because that was generally how Julian chose things. "I thought I saw something last night, on the 9th floor, looking up toward the penthouse. It turned out to be nothing." "What kind of nothing?" "The kind where I went and checked, and there was nothing there." Priya studied him for a long moment with the particular attentiveness she usually reserved for guests who were lying to her about how many people were staying in their room. "You don't look like a man who saw nothing."
"I'm tired."
It was probably the fog playing tricks. She let it go, which surprised him until he realized a half-hour later that she hadn't let it go at all. She'd simply decided to investigate it herself, quietly, in the way she did most things, and the first sign of that was when she set a folio down on the desk in front of him at 9:30 and said, without preamble, "Who checked out of the penthouse this morning?" "Nobody. Guests staying through the week." "His name's Achterberg," she said. "I pulled the registry. You know who else stayed in the penthouse this exact week, 3 months ago?" Julian felt something cold move down through his chest. "Who?" "A woman."
"Vance."
"Catherine Vance." I only remember because she was strange about her room service order, insisted on a very specific glass for her drink, made the kitchen send it back twice because it wasn't the right shape. Priya tapped the folio. Same week. Same room. Same kind of strange specificity. Probably means nothing. But it's the kind of nothing that made you look like that, isn't it? Julian didn't answer right away. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the fog was rolling back and off the harbor, and somewhere above them, 10 floors up, behind a curtain that never quite closed, a guest who may or may not have been the same man Julian had seen with his hands around another man's throat was, in all likelihood, ordering the same drink in the same glass that another guest had ordered 3 months before, down to the angle of the ice that wasn't there. It's not nothing, he said finally. I just don't know what it is yet. Priya leaned against the desk, arms crossed, the overhead chandelier throwing soft gold light across her face. Then I guess we'd better find out. He should have told her no. 11 years of training told him to tell her no, to remind her that their job was hospitality, not investigation, that whatever happened behind closed doors at the Aurelian was, by long unspoken tradition, none of their business as long as the bill got paid and the towels got refolded. Instead, he found himself nodding. Once, the way a man nods when he has already decided something and is only now admitting it to himself. Quietly, he said. We do this quietly. Priya smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days, and for a moment the fear that had kept him awake all night receded just slightly, replaced by something else, something that felt almost like relief, the relief of finally moving toward a thing instead of away from it. Neither of them noticed Augustine Farrow standing near the elevator banks at the far end of the lobby, hands clasped behind his back in the posture he always held while doing his rounds, watching them with an expression that, had either of them caught it, would have been very hard to read. And 3 floors above the lobby, in a corner office with a view of the harbor that almost no one was ever invited into, Imogen Castellane sat behind her desk with the lights low, a single security monitor glowing in front of her showing the grainy black and white feed from the 9th floor stairwell camera, a feed that, for exactly 6 minutes the previous night, had shown nothing at all. She watched the empty frame for a long moment, the way she might watch a held breath, and then she reached for the phone on her desk, dialed an internal extension, and said, very quietly, to whoever answered. He came up.
Good.
Let's see what he does next. She set the phone down, folded her hands on the desk, and turned to look out at the fog rolling and over the harbor, patient as the tide, patient as a woman who had been planning something for a very long time and had finally, after years of waiting, found someone worth waiting for. Chapter 2. A very reasonable explanation. The thing about explanations, Julian had come to understand over 11 years in hospitality, was that the good ones were never quite true, and the true ones were never quite good enough. By the time he was summoned to Imogen Castellane's office the following afternoon, he had already rehearsed his account of the previous night 3 different ways, and discarded all 3, because none of them sounded like something a sane, reliable employee would say out loud. Her office occupied the southeast corner of the 3rd floor, a room he had been inside perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, always for some version of the same purpose. A commendation, a correction, a quiet word about discretion. It smelled faintly of cedar and the particular old paper smell of a building that had never fully modernized its archives. Imogen sat behind a desk of dark oak that had, he suspected, been there since 1933 and gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her with the unhurried warmth of a woman who had never once in her life needed to raise her voice to get what she wanted. "Julian," she said, "tell me about the 9th floor." He told her. The stairwell window, the gap in the curtains, the two figures, the hands at the throat. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way he might describe a billing discrepancy, because he had learned long ago that the calmer you sounded, the more likely people were to believe you, and because, in this case, he genuinely didn't know whether he wanted to be believed. Imogen listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the desk, her expression unreadable in the particular way that made guests trust her instantly and made staff, Julian included, slightly uneasy in a manner none of them could ever quite articulate. "And when you went up," she said when he'd finished, Mr. Achterberg was alone, unharmed. The room was undisturbed. "Yes." "What do you think you saw, Julian?" It was, he noted, a carefully constructed question. Not what did you see, but what do you think you saw? Already conceding the ground, already inviting him to doubt himself before she had to do the work of doubting him for him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know what it looked like. I don't know what it was." "You've worked nights for 11 years, she said, not unkindly. "You know better than anyone how this building plays with light. That window catches reflections off 3 different floors depending on the fog. I've seen housekeepings where they saw someone standing in a room that's been vacant for a week. It happens. The Aurelian is old, Julian. Old buildings have old eyes." She paused. "I'm not saying you imagined it. I'm saying I'd rather you consider the possibility before you consider the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "That something happened in a guest's private suite that we are neither equipped nor entitled to investigate, and that bringing it to the attention of the authorities on the strength of 4 seconds through a fogged window would end one man's stay at this hotel and very possibly your career in it." She said this gently, the way you might explain a hard truth to a child, and that gentleness was, Julian thought, the most unsettling part of the entire conversation. "I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what it would cost to be wrong." There was a knock at the door, and Augustine Farrow let himself in without quite waiting to be told to, the way men who have worked somewhere for 30 years sometimes do. He had the heavy, settled build of a man who had once been genuinely formidable and had since softened at the edges without losing the posture of it, and he nodded once at Julian before turning his attention to Imogen. "Pulled the footage you asked for," he said. 9th floor stairwell, 11:40 to midnight. Nothing on it. Camera was working fine before and after. Just that window's a blind spot, always has been since before my time. Bad angle on the fixture. "Thank you, Augustine." "Anything else?" "Not tonight." She watched him go, and only once the door had closed again did she turn back to Julian. "You see the difficulty. I believe that you believe what you saw. I also have 11 cameras and 3 decades of institutional memory telling me that nothing happened. I'd like you to take tonight off. Paid. Get some rest. We can speak again tomorrow." It was, Julian recognized, an extraordinarily skillful piece of management. Not a denial, not an accusation, simply a soft closing of the door, wrapped in enough apparent concern that refusing it would make him look unreasonable. He thanked her because there was nothing else to do, and left the office with the distinct and uncomfortable sense that he had just lost an argument he hadn't realized he was having. He did not go home. Instead, he went down to the small windowless room behind the front desk that the staff called, with the kind of dry affection hospitality workers reserved for unglamorous things, the vault. Not because it held anything valuable, but because it housed the hotel's physical guest ledgers, decades of them, leather-bound and shelved by year, a tradition the Aurelian had never fully abandoned even after the computer system came in. Long-serving staff still made small handwritten notations in the current year's ledger, a habit that had started, as far as anyone could say, sometime under the previous owner, and simply never stopped. A few lines about a guest's preferences, a quirk, a thing worth remembering for next time. It was meant to be a kindness, a way of making strangers feel known. Julian found the current ledger and turned to the week's entries, and there, beside Desmond Achterberg's name and room number, in handwriting that was not his own and not Priya's, was a single line. Scotch, neat, faceted glass. No olive with the second course. Window seat preferred. Confirmed departure arrangements Thursday. He sat with that for a long moment. Guest preference notes were common enough. Scotch and window seats were the ordinary texture of luxury hospitality, the small intelligence that made return guests feel remembered. But confirmed departure arrangements struck him as an odd phrase for a man checking out of a hotel the normal way, on the normal day, with nothing more dramatic ahead of him than a town car to the airport. He flipped backward through the ledger, 3 months, to the week Priya had mentioned, and found Catherine Vance's entry. The handwriting was different. An earlier staff member's hand, looser, more slanted, but the structure of the note was nearly identical. Wine, Sauvignon Blanc, chilled glass replaced twice. No fish course. Window seat preferred. Confirmed departure arrangements Thursday. Same Thursday. Same phrase, word for word, down to the punctuation. Julian read it 3 times, the way you read something you don't quite believe the first 2 times, and felt the cold thing from the previous night settle back into his chest, heavier now because a feeling could be dismissed as fog and fatigue, but a sentence written twice in 2 different hands, 3 months apart, could not. He was still sitting there when Priya found him, letting herself into the vault with the particular quiet she used when she already suspected she was interrupting something. "You're supposed to be off tonight," she said. "I am off tonight." He didn't look up. "Come look at this." She read the 2 entries over his shoulder, and he watched her face do the same thing his had likely done, confusion sliding slowly into something colder. "Confirmed departure arrangements," she read aloud. That's an odd thing to write down for a man checking out on a normal Thursday with a town car booked. It is. You think it means something. "I think," Julian said carefully, "that I don't like coincidences that are written in the same words twice." Priya pulled a second chair over and sat, the folder of guest registries still tucked under her arm from earlier. He hadn't realized she'd kept it, had assumed she'd filed it away as idle curiosity satisfied. Apparently not. "I did some digging today," she said, "while you were upstairs getting reassured." There was an edge to the word reassured that told him she already knew, somehow, how that conversation had gone. "I pulled every penthouse stay for the last year. There's a pattern, Julian. Not every week, but every few months, there's a guest who matches this. Specific drink order. Window seat. A note about departure arrangements on a Thursday. 6 of them, going back 14 months. Different names every time. Different genders, different ages even, but the requests are nearly identical." 6, Julian repeated. 6 that I found in an afternoon with a registry and too much coffee. I'd bet money there are more further back. The ledgers only go digital 3 years ago. Before that it's all paper, and good luck finding anyone willing to let us into the archive for that. Julian sat back in his chair and looked at the shelves of leather-bound ledgers stretching back further than either of them had worked here, further than Imogen had been general manager, further, perhaps, than either of them could easily trace. 11 years of believing he understood every quiet rhythm of this building, and it turned out there was a rhythm running underneath it the entire time, patient and exact, that he had simply never been positioned to hear. "Why would anyone keep records of this?" he said, half to himself. "If it's something worth hiding, why write it down at all? Why not just remember it?" "Maybe because it isn't one person remembering it," Priya said. "Maybe it has to survive a person leaving. A shift change. A different concierge on duty. You don't write things down for yourself, Julian. You write them down so someone else can pick up where you left off." The thought sat between them in the small windowless room, the hum of the building's old ventilation the only sound, and Julian felt the shape of something much larger than a strange noise complaint or an unsettling for seconds through a fogged window beginning, very slowly, to take form at the edges of his understanding. Something institutional, something that had outlived individual staff members and individual guests, and quite possibly outlived Constantine Albrecht himself, something that the Aurelian had been quietly doing Thursday after Thursday for longer than anyone currently working there had been alive to notice. "We should talk to someone who's been here longer than both of us," Priya said. "Augustine." "Augustine," she agreed. "He's been here 30 years. If anyone's seen this pattern before, accidentally or otherwise, it's him." Julian thought of Augustine's face in Imogen's office an hour earlier, the easy, unbothered report of an empty stairwell camera, the casual bad angle on the fixture, and felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite suspicion yet, but was close enough to it that he didn't enjoy the feeling. "Carefully," he said. "We ask him carefully." They found Augustine 2 hours later in the small security office in the basement, a low-ceilinged room lined with monitors that Julian had been inside perhaps 3 times in his career, each time on routine business. Augustine was eating a late dinner out of a tin-foil container, feet up on the edge of the desk, the monitors behind him cycling silently through the hotel's public spaces, lobby, bar, pool deck, parking structure, all of it grainy and slightly green in the night vision feed. "Voss," he said, not looking up immediately. "Thought you were off tonight. I was curious about something. Wondered if you'd humor me." Augustine set down his fork and gave Julian his full attention, which was, Julian had always thought, one of the man's more reassuring qualities. Whatever else was true of him, he didn't do anything by half measures, not even listening. "Go on. How long have you worked here?" 31 years in October. Started as a bellhop under the old man himself. Albrecht. He said the name with a kind of fondness that surprised Julian, an old loyalty that had clearly outlived its object. "Why? Have you ever noticed anything strange about the penthouse? Specifically, guests who seem to repeat the same requests. Same drink. Same seat. A note about confirming departure arrangements." Something crossed Augustine's face, there and gone fast enough that Julian almost convinced himself afterward he'd imagined it. But Priya, standing beside him, caught it too. He could tell from the way her posture shifted slightly, the way her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Lot of guests repeat requests," Augustine said, and his voice had taken on a careful, even quality it hadn't had a moment before. "Rich people like consistency. It's why they come back. This is more specific than consistency." Augustine held his gaze for a long moment, and in that moment Julian saw something flicker behind the older man's eyes. Not deception, exactly, or not only deception. Something more like the look of a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd made peace with avoiding for a very long time, and finding, suddenly, that the avoiding had gotten harder. "You should let this go, Voss," Augustine said finally, quietly, and there was something almost like warning in it. Not threat, but the particular tone of an older man trying, clumsily, to protect a younger one from something he didn't have the words to name directly. I mean that as a friend. Whatever you think you're circling, it's bigger than a noise complaint, and it's not the kind of thing that ends well for the people who go digging. Bigger how? Augustine looked at him for another long moment, and Julian hoped, he might actually answer. Instead, the older man picked his fork back up, turned his eyes back to his dinner, and said, in a voice that closed the conversation as firmly as a door, "Get some sleep, kid. You'll feel different about all this tomorrow." They left the security office in silence, and it wasn't until they were back in the elevator, doors closed, the hotel's quiet machinery humming around them, that Priya finally spoke. "He knows something. He knows something," Julian agreed. "And he's scared of it." Julian thought of the careful, even quality that had come into Augustine's voice, the way a genuinely calm man does not need to work that hard to sound calm. "Or scared for us," he said. "I'm not sure those are different things." The elevator carried them up through the dark spine of the hotel, past the floor where, 2 nights ago, Julian had watched something happen that the building's own cameras insisted had never occurred, and as the doors opened onto the lobby, empty now, chandeliers dimmed for the night, the pianist long gone home, he found himself looking, almost involuntarily, toward the revolving door, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching him the way he had spent 11 years watching everyone else. There was no one there. But for the first time since he'd taken this job, Julian had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that the hotel was watching him back. Chapter 3. The Second Guest. There was a particular quality to the Aurelian's lobby in the hour before dawn that Julian had never managed to describe to anyone who hadn't worked a hotel night shift themselves, a stillness that wasn't empty so much as held, the building seeming to gather itself in the gap between the last late check-in and the first early departure, as if even the marble were resting. He had always found that hour peaceful. 2 nights after his conversation with Augustine, he found it unbearable, because peace required a kind of trust in the building that he was no longer sure he had. He spent most of that night at the desk doing the ordinary work of the job, confirming a wake-up call for a guest flying to Geneva, fielding a complaint about thin pillows from a man in 904, walking a tipsy couple from the bar to the elevator with the practiced gentleness of someone who had done it 1,000 times. And underneath all of it, running like a current beneath still water, he turned over the conversation with Augustine again and again, looking for the seam in it, the place where the old man's carefulness had cracked. "You'll feel different about all this tomorrow." It wasn't a denial. Julian kept returning to that. A man who genuinely believed there was nothing to find didn't tell you to let it go for your own good. He told you you were imagining things, or he laughed, or he changed the subject with the easy contempt of someone humoring a tired colleague. Augustine had done none of that. He had looked, for one unguarded second, like a man standing very close to the edge of something he had spent 30 years walking carefully around. Priya arrived for her shift at 11, dropped her bag behind the desk, and didn't bother with small talk. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I kept thinking about the ledger entries. So I went back through the digital records again this morning before I came in, and I found something." "Go on." "All 6 repeat guests I found yesterday, Achterberg, Vance, for others, they all paid with different cards, different names, obviously. But 4 of the 6 used the same address for their billing correspondence. A post office box. Not a home address, not a corporate one. A box at a private mail service 2 blocks from here." She slid a folded printout across the desk toward him. I called this morning, pretending to confirm a delivery. They wouldn't give me a name on the account. Said it was registered to a holding company. Julian unfolded the printout and studied the address, an ordinary commercial block downtown that he must have walked past 100 times without ever once considering it might matter. What's the company called? Something deliberately boring. Meridian Asset Services. I looked it up. It's registered, it files paperwork, it looks completely legitimate on paper. But its only listed officer is a lawyer who specializes in estate dissolution and discrete asset transfer. The kind of lawyer rich people hire when they want something to disappear quietly. A business, a marriage, a name. Julian set the printout down slowly. Outside, beyond the tall lobby windows, the fog had thinned slightly with the approach of morning, revealing the first gray suggestion of the harbor beyond the street lamps. A name, he repeated. That's what I keep coming back to. What if departure arrangements doesn't mean checking out of a hotel? What if it means something closer to disappearing from a life? It was, Julian thought, exactly the kind of idea that should have sounded absurd in the cold light of a hotel lobby at 11 at night, the sort of thing you dismiss instantly if a guest proposed it to you over a nightcap, a thriller novel notion with no place in the actual texture of running a 5-star property. And yet it fit. It fit the spotless room. It fit the empty camera feed. It fit Augustine's careful, frightened voice telling him to let it go. It fit, most of all, the strange staged quality of what he'd seen through that 9th-floor window. Not a murder committed in a fit of passion or violence, but something choreographed, rehearsed, performed for an audience of exactly one person who wasn't supposed to be watching. If you're right, Julian said slowly, then what I saw 2 nights ago wasn't someone being killed.
No.
It was someone practicing how to look like they'd been killed. Priya didn't answer right away. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not the easy curiosity of someone chasing an interesting puzzle, but something more serious, more careful, as if she too were only now understanding the actual size of the thing they'd started pulling at. That's a strange business to be in, she said finally, helping people fake their own deaths.
It's an old one, though.
Julian thought of the building around them, 93 years of brass and marble and quiet accommodation. Hotels have always kept secrets for rich people. Affairs, bankruptcies, things that needed to happen somewhere private, with staff who knew how to forget what they'd seen. This isn't so different. It's just more organized than an affair. Organized enough to need a ledger code. Organized enough to survive 30 years of staff turnover. Priya pulled her chair closer to the desk, lowering her voice though there was no one else in the lobby to hear them. Julian, this isn't something Augustine stumbled into by accident, is it? The way he reacted. That wasn't a man who half remembers a weird thing from years ago. That was a man protecting something he's part of. Julian thought of Augustine's loyalty to the old man, Albrecht, the genuine fondness in his voice when he'd said the name. 31 years of service, starting as a bellhop under the founder's son, rising slowly through the ranks until he ran security for the entire property. A man like that didn't just witness an institution's secrets. Eventually, inevitably, he became one of its custodians. We need to see further back than the digital records, Julian said. If this has been going on for years, decades, maybe there'll be a pattern further back than 3 years of computer files. Paper ledgers. The archive. The locked one in the sublevel. You know about that? Everyone's heard about it. Nobody's ever been inside it, as far as I know. Housekeeping calls it the vault under the vault. Priya allowed herself a small, humorless smile. Cute, right? Apparently, it used to be a wine cellar before Prohibition, then something else during Prohibition, and now it's just locked and nobody asks why, because in a hotel this old, there's always something locked that nobody asks about. Until now. Until now, she agreed. It took them 4 more days to find a way down there, and in that time the hotel handed them 2 more pieces of the pattern, each arriving with a casual indifference of ordinary business, each landing like a stone dropped into still water. The first came on a Tuesday, when a guest named Holloway checked into the penthouse for a 3-night stay and, within an hour of arriving, placed an order for scotch, neat, no ice, in the hotel's heaviest faceted rocks glass. And when room service delivered it in the standard tumbler instead, sent it back twice until the kitchen produced the exact glass he'd specified, apparently from memory, though he had never stayed at the property before according to the registry. Julian took the call himself that night, stood in the service hallway outside the kitchen listening to the chef complain good-naturedly about a guest who apparently couldn't tell one rocks glass from another, and felt the cold, careful thrill of watching a hypothesis confirm itself in real time. He found the relevant page in the leather ledger an hour later. The note, in handwriting he now recognized as Imogen's own, small, precise, a faint leftward slant, read, "Scotch, neat, faceted glass. No olive with the second course. Window seat preferred. Confirmed departure arrangements Thursday." Word for word. The 3rd time he'd read that exact sentence in 4 days. The second piece came from Priya, who had taken to spending her off-shift hours in the small staff break room poring over old printed schedules, looking for a pattern and who had been on duty during each of the repeat guest stays. What she found, when she laid the schedules side by side, was that a particular name appeared adjacent to every single one of the 6 known cases, listed not as a guest but as a staff contact, under a designation neither of them had seen before, Concierge Level 3, W. Cabrillo. "There's no W. Cabrillo on the current staff roster," Priya said, sliding the printout across the break room table to Julian. "I checked twice. Maybe a contractor. Outside consultant." For what kind of consulting needs 3 separate appearances at 3 separate penthouse stays, always during the same week of the guest's visit, always logged under a designation that doesn't exist anywhere else in the building's organizational chart? Julian didn't have an answer for that, but 2 nights later, working the front desk at midnight, he got one anyway. Not from a document, but from the elevator doors opening to reveal a woman he had never seen before, stepping into the lobby with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her life needed to check a room number. She was perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a dark green cocktail dress that managed to look both effortless and precisely chosen, dark hair cut in a sharp angular bob that Julian would have sworn, had he been asked to describe her an hour later, was a different color and a different length than it actually was. There was something about her that resisted being fixed in memory, a quality he couldn't name but recognized instantly as deliberate. She crossed to the bar, which was technically closed but where the night bartender, a young man named Felix, was still wiping down glasses, and ordered a Sazerac in a voice pitched low enough that Julian, 20 feet away at the desk, had to strain to catch it. He watched her for a long moment without quite deciding to, the way you watch a shape in a dark room that you can't yet identify but instinctively know matters, and when she turned her head and caught him looking, she didn't startle, didn't look away, didn't do any of the things a guest caught under observation usually did. She smiled, a small, knowing, almost amused smile, and raised her glass to him slightly, as if acknowledging a private joke only the 2 of them were in on. Then she turned back to the bar, and Julian, his pulse loud in his ears, made himself look down at his desk and continue the work in front of him, though his hands had gone cold and he couldn't, for several minutes, remember what the work in front of him actually was. He told Priya about it the moment her shift started the next evening, and watched her face shift through the same progression his own must have gone through: curiosity, recognition, unease. Dark green dress.
Sharp bob.
Late 30s. Priya repeated slowly. Julian, that's not the first time I've seen someone matching that description in this lobby. I just never thought anything of it because she never seemed to be staying here.
She's always at the bar. Never the desk. Never checks in.
Never checks out. I assumed she was meeting someone. Maybe she was. Maybe she still is. You think she's the same person every time? Cabrillo. I think, Julian said, that whoever she is, she's the one constant in every version of this pattern. The guests change. The names change. She doesn't. It was that detail, the steadiness of one woman moving through 6 or more lives that weren't her own, present at every staged disappearance, like a thread running invisibly through years of strangers' final nights as themselves, that finally pushed Julian past the point of caution he had been holding onto for nearly a week. He had told himself in the days since the 9th floor window that he was simply gathering information, being careful, being the kind of methodical observer his job had trained him to be. But watching that woman raise her glass to him with the easy familiarity of someone greeting a colleague rather than a stranger, he understood, finally, that the hotel already knew he was watching, had perhaps known from the very first night. The question was no longer whether he would be caught looking. The question was what they intended to do about it, and whether he would find the answer before they decided. "We need into that archive," he said. "Tonight, if we can manage it. Augustine has the keys to the sublevel. Augustine won't give them to us." "No," Priya agreed. "But Imogen keeps a master set in her office. 3rd drawer down, left side of the desk. I've seen her use it once, when the elevator inspector needed access to the machine room." Julian looked at her for a long moment, weighing what he was about to ask of her. That they break, gently but unmistakably, the central unspoken rule of the entire profession, the rule that had built his entire identity for 11 years. You do not go where you are not invited. He thought of Imogen's office, the warm cedar smell of it, the careful kindness with which she had told him to take the night off and rest, the particular skill with which she had made him doubt his own eyes without ever once raising her voice. He thought, too, of the woman at the bar, raising her glass to him like an old friend. "Tonight," he said again, "before she has a chance to decide what to do about what I've already seen." Priya nodded slowly, and there was something steady in her face now that Julian recognized, because he had felt it grow in himself over the past week. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but something stronger than fear, the particular clarity that comes from finally choosing to walk toward a thing instead of away from it. "Tonight," she agreed. Outside, the fog was rolling back and off the harbor, thick and patient, wrapping itself around the Aurelian's old stone the way it had every night for 93 years, indifferent to whatever quiet reckonings were unfolding inside. Chapter 4. Checklist. Imogen's office was locked, but the lock on a general manager's door at the Aurelian was, Julian had always understood, more ceremonial than functional, a courtesy extended to senior staff during off hours, not a genuine barrier, because the hotel's culture of discretion had never anticipated needing to keep its own people out of its own rooms. He let himself and Priya in with a master key he carried for emergency access at 1:20 in the morning, while the lobby below sat under the half-watch of a junior clerk Priya trusted not to ask questions. The office in darkness was a different room than the one Julian had sat in 4 days earlier. Without the warm desk lamp, without Imogen's careful, unhurried voice filling it, it felt smaller, more ordinary. Just an old room with old furniture, the harbor fog pressing gray against the windows. Third drawer, left side, Priya whispered, already moving toward the desk. She found the keys exactly where she'd remembered them, a small brass ring with 4 keys, none of them labeled, all of them old enough to have been cut before either of them was born. Julian, meanwhile, found himself drawn to the bookshelf along the far wall, where a row of identical leather spines, unmarked except for small embossed years, stood in a long, unbroken line, older versions of the ledger he and Priya had already pored over downstairs, going back further than the ones kept in the vault. He pulled one at random, a year stamped near the bottom of the spine in faded gold. A date some 22 years past, long before Imogen had run anything, long before Julian had been hired, back when Constantine Albrecht himself would still have walked these halls. He flipped through it quickly under the thin gray light from the window, and there, 3 months apart, in handwriting that wasn't Imogen's and wasn't Augustine's but belonged, evidently, to some other long-departed staff member, the same sentence appeared, twice, exactly as it had appeared in every ledger since. Confirmed departure arrangements, Thursday. 22 years, he said quietly. It goes back at least 22 years. Priya looked up from the desk, the keys cold and heavy in her palm. That's not something Imogen started then.
No.
I don't think it is. Julian closed the old ledger gently and slid it back into its place on the shelf, careful to leave no visible gap. I think she inherited it. They left the office as they'd found it, locking the door behind them out of habit more than necessity, and took the service stairs down rather than risk the noise of the elevator at this hour. The sublevel beneath the vault was reached through a narrow door behind the laundry facility, a door Julian had walked past perhaps 1,000 times without ever once wondering what lay on the other side of it. The kind of architectural blind spot every old building accumulates, a door that becomes invisible simply by never being opened. The lock here was older, heavier, clearly original to whatever purpose the room had first served, and it took 3 attempts with 3 different keys before the 4th one turned with a grinding reluctance that suggested it hadn't been used in some time. The door swung inward onto a short flight of stone steps, and the smell that rose to meet them was unmistakable even in the dark. Old paper, mildew held carefully at bay, the particular mineral coolness of a room that had never been properly heated in 90 years. Julian found a light switch just inside the door, a brass toggle that looked like it belonged to the building's original wiring, and the room that flickered into view around them was smaller than he'd expected and far more ordered. Shelving ran along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, lined with boxes and bound ledgers organized by year in a system someone had clearly maintained with real care across decades. A single desk sat in the center of the room, bare except for a green-shaded brass lamp and a leather-bound book larger than any of the others, its cover unmarked, its spine cracked from frequent use. "This is it," Priya breathed, crossing to the desk. "This has to be it." Julian followed, and together they opened the unmarked ledger under the lamp's soft pool of light. The first page bore no title, no explanation, simply a column of dates beginning some 4 decades back, each paired with a name, a room number, and a short string of what Julian now recognized instantly as the protocol's coded shorthand: drink order, seating preference, a Thursday confirmation. But it was the second column, one he hadn't seen in any of the more recent ledgers, that made his breath catch. Beside each entry, in a small, consistent hand. Someone had recorded a single additional notation, a destination. Not a room number. A place. Lisbon.
Buenos Aires.
A town in the Yukon Julian had never heard of. A monastery on a Greek island. 40 years of people, each one given a new drink order and a new name and, eventually, a new life somewhere far from the one they'd walked into the Aurelian carrying. It's not just disappearing, Julian said slowly, the weight of it settling over him. It's relocation, a complete service. They don't just help people vanish. They help them become someone else, somewhere else. That's not cheap, Priya murmured, scanning further down the page. Look at this column. Payments, routed through what looks like a dozen different shell entities. Whatever this costs, it's not something an ordinary person could afford. Julian turned several pages forward, tracking the years, watching the handwriting change as one custodian gave way to another. And then, near the back third of the book, he found a section that made him stop entirely. The entries here were more recent, the dates running up through the past year, and one of them, 8 months back, was marked differently than every entry before or since, a small red in the margin beside the name, the only mark of its kind in the entire ledger. The name beside the D was Frederick Anselm Kovac. The notation beside his name did not include a destination. It simply read, in handwriting Julian now recognized with a cold certainty as Imogen's own. Incomplete. CEF. Yef. Priya whispered, Augustine Farrow. Julian stared at the two initials for a long moment, feeling the careful structure he'd been building in his mind over the past week. A story about wealthy people quietly buying their way out of their old lives, strange but ultimately victimless, a kind of elegant criminal hospitality, shift under him into something darker. Incomplete was not a word that belonged to a successful disappearance. It was the word you used for something that had gone wrong and had then been filed away, carefully, in a ledger that nobody outside this room was ever meant to read. We need to find out who Kovac was, Julian said, and what happened to him, and what Augustine had to do with it. Before Julian could answer, a sound from above made them both go still, the unmistakable creak of the laundry room door, followed by footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the sublevel stairs. Priya's hand found the lamp switch and killed it instantly, plunging the room into the kind of total darkness that only existed below ground, and they stood frozen among the shelves of 40 years of other people's vanished lives, listening to the footsteps descend. The door at the top of the stairs opened. A flashlight beam swept across the stone steps, and a voice. Augustine's voice, low, tired, unsurprised in a way that told Julian instantly that this was not the first time he'd had to do this, spoke into the dark. I know you're down here, Voss. Saved you the trouble of explaining yourselves. Come on up. Both of you. There was nothing to do but obey. Julian found Priya's hand in the dark for just a moment. Not romantic, simply human, the brief grounding contact of two people about to face something together. And then they climbed the stairs into the flashlight's glare, where Augustine stood waiting in his shirt sleeves, looking older than Julian had ever seen him, the easy weight he usually carried gone out of his shoulders entirely. You shouldn't have come down here, he said, not angrily, but with something that sounded almost like grief. Who was Frederick Kovac? Julian said. Augustine flinched, just slightly, at the name, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, looking past Julian into the dark room behind him as if he could see, even now, exactly which page they'd found. Not here, he said finally. Not like this. He gestured toward the stairs leading back up to the laundry room, his flashlight beam wavering slightly. "Come up to the rooftop terrace. It's closed this time of night. We can talk there, the three of us, and I'll tell you what I can. But I want you to understand something first, before you hear any of it." "What's that?" Augustine looked at him with an expression Julian had never seen on the older man's face before. Something raw, something that had clearly been waiting a very long time for permission to surface. "This isn't the kind of secret that makes you feel clever for finding it," he said quietly. "It's the kind that's going to cost you something to know. I'd have rather you never asked. But you did, and I'm too old and too tired to keep lying to a kid I've watched grow into a good man for 11 years.
So,
Rooftop. Give me 10 minutes to make sure nobody else is wandering where they shouldn't be tonight." He turned and led them back up through the laundry room, past the silent machines, out into the hushed corridor beyond, and as they walked, Julian found himself watching the back of Augustine's heavy shoulders and thinking, with a clarity that felt almost like grief itself, that whatever they were about to learn on that rooftop, the easy, uncomplicated trust he'd carried for the older man across 11 years of working this hotel together was already, quietly, becoming something else. Above them, through gaps in the building's old stonework, the fog had begun, finally, to lift, and somewhere far below, in the harbor, the first foghorn of the morning sounded once, low and mournful, carrying across the water toward a city that had no idea how many of its missing people had walked out through the Aurelian's quiet, accommodating doors. Chapter 5. Concierge Level 3. The rooftop terrace of the Aurelian was closed to guests after 11, a fact the hotel enforced more for liability reasons than any genuine concern about late-night views, and at this hour it belonged entirely to the three of them. Julian, Priya, and Augustine, standing among the shuttered cabana chairs and dark planters while the city spread out below in a wash of scattered light, the harbor a black mirror beyond it, the fog finally thinning enough to reveal the first pale suggestion of dawn along the eastern rooftops. The terrace had been one of the hotel's quiet luxuries since a renovation sometime in the 70s. A long rectangle of teak decking and potted olive trees that never quite thrived in the salt air, ringed by a stone parapet low enough to lean against, and high enough to feel safe doing it. By day it hosted champagne brunches and the occasional small wedding. At this hour it held nothing but wind, the distant churn of the harbor, and three people about to have a conversation none of them had wanted to have. Augustine didn't speak right away. He walked to the edge of the terrace, both hands braced against the cold stone, and looked out at the water for so long that Julian began to wonder whether the climb up here had been a stalling tactic after all, a way of buying himself a little more time inside the silence before he had to give it up for good. You ever wonder why a place like this keeps a man like me around for 31 years? Augustine said finally, not turning. Security at most hotels is a young man's job. You stand by the door, you look imposing, you call the police if anything gets out of hand, and in 5 years you've moved on to something that pays better. I never moved on. People used to ask me why. I told them I liked the work. That wasn't a lie exactly. It also wasn't the whole truth. What's the whole truth? Julian asked. That I knew things about this building that made it impossible to leave. Augustine turned to face them at last, and in the pale pre-dawn light his face looked older than Julian had ever seen it, the easy authority he usually carried entirely absent, replaced by something heavier. Constantine Albrecht built half his fortune on things people weren't supposed to know about. His father ran liquor up through the old service tunnels during Prohibition. The same passages the kitchen still uses today to move deliveries in from the loading dock, if you've ever wondered why that corridor curves the way it does instead of running straight. By the time I started here as a bellhop, the old man had been running this place for 30 years, and he had a particular gift. He could look at a person checking in at midnight, alone, carrying too little luggage for the length of their stay, and know almost instantly what they needed and couldn't bring themselves to ask for out loud. "What does that have to do with Kovac?" Julian said, more sharply than he intended. "I'm getting there, Voss." Augustine's voice carried no real reproach, only weariness. "Some things you can't say fast. Let me tell it my own way, or I won't get through it at all, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering whether the version you finally heard was the true one or just the convenient one." Julian nodded, chastened, and stepped back slightly, letting the older man find his own pace. "There were people who came to Albrecht over the years," Augustine continued. "Desperate people, mostly, though you'd never have guessed it from how they dressed or what car dropped them at the curb. A woman who came through in the early 80s. I remember her because I carried her bags myself, my first month on the job, running from a husband who'd nearly killed her twice already and would have finished the job the third time. Everyone around her could see it coming, and nobody could do a single useful thing about it, because the law in those days protected men like him a great deal better than it protected her. A man, years later, who discovered his own family's company was laundering money for people who would have killed him the moment they realized he knew. People who needed, more than anything else in the world, to simply stop existing as the person they'd become. Albrecht had the tunnels. He had staff who'd learned, generation after generation, how to forget or face the moment it left the building. And he had something rarer than either of those things. A network built up over decades through favors and silence, and the particular currency that flows toward men who can be trusted absolutely, of people who could manufacture an entirely new life for someone willing to pay for it. New papers. A plausible history. A town somewhere far enough away and quiet enough that nobody would ever think to go looking. He helped people disappear, Priya said quietly, almost to herself. He helped people survive, Augustine said, something fierce entering his voice for the first time that night. You weren't here for the ones who came through truly desperate, either of you. I was. I watched that woman walk out of this hotel as someone else entirely, watched her get into a car under a name that didn't exist 3 days earlier, and I knew it in my bones the way you know weather is about to turn. That her husband would have eventually killed her if she'd stayed who she was. The world doesn't always give people a clean way out of the lives they're trapped in. Most of the time, it doesn't give them any way out at all. Albrecht built one, here, quietly, under the noses of a city that thought it knew everything worth knowing about this hotel. It was never legal. It was never going to be legal. But more often than it was anything else, it was good. Julian thought of the ledger downstairs. 40 years of names and destinations, the quiet machinery of it running beneath the hotel's polished surface, each entry tended with the same precision the Aurelian brought to its finest suites, its best vintages, its most demanding guests. He thought, too, of how strange it was to hold both truths at once, that something could be a crime and also, in its own careful way, a kindness. And Imogen inherited it, Julian said. Imogen built half of what it's become. Augustine's expression softened slightly at her name, in a way that surprised Julian. Not romantic, he didn't think, but something closer to the protective fondness of a man who had watched someone grow into a weight too heavy for one person to carry alone. She came to Albrecht herself, years before she ever worked here properly. A young woman in real trouble. The kind of trouble I won't describe to you, because it's hers to tell if she ever chooses to, not mine to hand over on a rooftop at 5 in the morning. He helped her the way he helped everyone else who walked through that door at the end of their rope. And when she came back, years later, asking for a job instead of a favor, he recognized something in her he hadn't seen in anyone else who'd ever come looking for work here. Gave her more responsibility than anyone her age had any right to. By the time he was dying, slowly over the better part of a year, in a private room 2 floors below where we're standing now, she was the only person in this building he trusted to keep the whole machine running the way he'd always run it.
Carefully.
Selectively. For people who genuinely needed it, not simply for whoever found it convenient. Then what went wrong with Kovac? Julian pressed, unable to hold the question back any longer. For the first time since they'd come up onto the terrace, Augustine's composure cracked entirely. He turned back toward the harbor, his hands gripping the stone parapet hard enough that his knuckles went pale even in the dim light, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, the kind of voice men used for confessions they'd rehearsed alone for months and still couldn't make come out steady. Kovac wasn't desperate the way the others were, he said. He was rich and frightened and running from consequences he'd earned rather than survived. Some kind of financial fraud. The details aren't mine to share, even now. Imogen took the case anyway. I don't know why, not entirely. Maybe she was tired that year. Maybe the fee mattered more than it should have. Keeping the archive running, paying the people who needed paying to keep it quiet. None of that comes cheap, whatever anyone tells you about loyalty being its own reward. Maybe she simply believed, the way Albrecht always taught her to believe, that everyone deserves one honest chance to start over, even the ones who don't entirely deserve it. The protocol called for a staged event in the penthouse, the kind of rehearsal you've already seen a version of yourself, Voss, with Achterberg, just 2 weeks ago. A controlled scare, theatrical, harmless by design, meant to be the dramatic centerpiece of a story he'd carry with him for the rest of his new life. That he'd nearly died and walked away from it and chosen, in that moment, to become someone better.
He stopped.
The silence stretched long enough that the foghorn sounded again, farther off now than the last time, and Priya finally said, gently, the way you'd coax a frightened animal closer. What happened, Augustine? His heart gave out, Augustine said, the words coming out raw, scraped thin. Mid-rehearsal. A man playing dead, going through the motions we'd walked him through a dozen times in the planning, actually dying, right there in front of the 2 of us running the scene. By the time either of us understood it wasn't theater anymore, it was already too late to be anything else. He pressed the heel of one hand against his eyes for a long moment, and when he lowered it again his face had gone flat with exhaustion, the face of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried alone for the better part of a year. We couldn't call it in as what it actually was. Couldn't explain a dead man behind hidden paneling in a room he wasn't even registered to. Couldn't explain 40 years of records that would have come spilling out behind him the moment anyone started asking real questions. Imogen made the call because somebody had to, and there wasn't time to debate it. We moved him. Made it look like he died 2 floors down, in his actual hotel room, under his real name, the way he'd been registered the entire time, a heart attack in his sleep, nothing more sinister than a man whose body finally gave out on vacation. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Men his age die quietly in hotel rooms more often than anyone in this business likes to admit out loud. And you covered it up, Julian said. For her. I covered it up because by the time I understood what had actually happened, There was no version of telling the truth that didn't end 40 years of work that had saved more lives, by my own count, than it had ever cost. Augustine turned to face them both fully now, and there was something pleading in his expression, the look of a man desperate to be understood rather than simply judged and dismissed. I'm not asking either of you to think I made the right choice. I've asked myself every single night since whether I did, and some nights I still don't have an answer I can live with comfortably. But I want you to understand that it was never simple. A man died, and it was a tragedy, full stop, no excuse changes that. And it was also, somehow, in the same breath, the first time in 40 years that this thing had ever actually hurt someone instead of saving them, and Imogen has spent every day since trying to make absolutely certain it never happens again, even while she's kept the rest of it running for the people who still need it. Why keep it running at all? Priya said. After something like that. Why not just stop, close the whole thing down, walk away clean? Because there are people right now, tonight, somewhere in this building, who need this exactly the way that frightened woman needed it back in 1981. Augustine's voice hardened slightly, conviction steadying it. Achterberg isn't a good man. I won't sit here and pretend otherwise to either of you. I've read his file, and he's running from consequences he earned, same as Kovac was. But there are others coming. There are always others coming, and Imogen has to decide, every single time, whether the person sitting across from her is worth the risk she's carrying. I don't envy her that decision. I've watched it age her in ways nobody else in this building understands, not even you two, not yet. Julian stood at the parapet beside the old man, looking out at the lightning sky, the first hint of true color finally bleeding into the gray along the horizon, and felt something complicated settle into place where his anger had been a moment before. Not forgiveness, not yet, not anything so clean as that, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that the story he'd been constructing in his mind over the past week, of a hotel quietly running a cold and mercenary criminal enterprise behind its polished facade, was true and also nowhere near the whole truth. The whole truth was messier than that, sadder, more human, threaded through with 40 years of small mercies extended to people the rest of the world had already given up on. There's a name in the ledger I didn't ask you about, Julian said quietly. The one marked with the red. Incomplete. CAF. That's you. Augustine nodded once, heavily, as though the admission cost him something physical. I was the one who found him, slumped against the rehearsal room wall, before the second staff member even understood what she was looking at. I was the one who made the calls that night, moved what needed moving, kept my voice steady enough on the phone to a doctor I trusted that the story held together. If this ever comes apart, Voss, I'm not the one who'll be standing behind Imogen's desk explaining 40 years of paperwork to the police. I'm the man whose initials sit beside a dead client's name in a ledger nobody outside 3 people was ever meant to find. I've known that since the night it happened. I've made what peace with it I can. Some nights I manage better than others. Tonight isn't one of the better ones. Does Kovac have family? Priya asked, her voice quieter now. Anyone who still doesn't know the truth? Augustine's face tightened, the lines around his eyes deepening in the strengthening light.
A daughter.
Estranged before any of this happened. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 years when he first came to us looking for a way out. She believes, same as the rest of the world believes, that her father died of natural causes on a business trip he never should have taken. I think about her sometimes, more than I'd like to admit. Wonder whether she lies awake some nights wishing she'd had one more conversation with him before the line went permanently quiet. He looked at Julian directly, and something in his expression hardened into resolve. That's the part of this I've never managed to live with cleanly, not once, not in 8 months. Everyone else who's ever walked through this hotel's particular service got a second chance at an actual life somewhere. Kovac's daughter got nothing at all, not even a real ending. Just a story that was never true, that she's never had any reason to doubt, and that I helped build for her without her ever knowing I'd taken something from her in the process. The sky over the harbor had gone from black to a deep, washed-out gray, the first commercial fishing boats beginning their slow crawl out past the breakwater toward open water, indifferent to everything unfolding 11 stories above them. Julian found himself thinking, with the particular exhausted clarity that only arrives near dawn after a sleepless night, that he now understood the shape of what he'd stumbled into far better than he had an hour earlier. And understood, too, with equal clarity, that understanding it hadn't made the decision waiting for him any easier to make. He could go to Imogen with everything he now knew. He could go to the authorities, end it cleanly, let the truth fall where it fell regardless of who it landed on. Or he could do nothing at all, and let the Aurelian continue exactly as it had for 40 years, weighing each new desperate stranger against the memory of one man's heart failing in a hidden room behind a false wall. "Does Imogen know you're telling us any of this?" he asked. Augustine shook his head slowly.
No.
"And I expect there'll be a price for it one way or another when she finds out, and she will find out. She finds out everything eventually. That's half of what makes her good at this. But I've watched you for 3 years, Voss. Watched the way you notice things everyone else walks right past without a second glance. I think Imogen's had her eye on you for longer than you realize, and for reasons that go well beyond your skill at smoothing over noise complaints. I think you deserve to understand what you're actually being considered for before you decide what to do with any of this." He straightened slightly, some of his old composure returning, though it sat differently on him now. Hard one, rather than easy.
Go home.
Sleep if you can manage it, which I doubt. There's more to this than even what I've told you tonight, and you're going to need your wits about you before it's finished. He left them there on the rooftop as the sky continued its slow gray lightening toward true dawn, his heavy footsteps receding toward the stairwell door, and Julian stood beside Priya at the parapet for a long while without speaking, the two of them watching the fishing boats thread their way out past the harbor mouth one by one, carrying the ordinary, unremarkable business of the city forward into another day that neither of them felt entirely part of anymore. "What are you going to do?" Priya asked finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. Julian thought of Imogen's careful kindness in that third-floor office, the warmth that had made him doubt his own eyes without her ever once raising her voice, of Augustine's 31 years of quiet, complicated loyalty, finally cracking open on a rooftop at dawn. Of a daughter somewhere out there in the waking city who believed a comforting lie about her father's death because the alternative would unravel 4 decades of other people's second chances at being alive. "I don't know yet," he admitted, and for the first time in over a week, the admission didn't feel like a failure of his own observational skill, but simply the truth. "But I think it's time I talked to Imogen myself, without her managing the conversation this time. Without a desk between us, and without her deciding in advance how much of the truth I'm allowed to carry out of the room." Chapter 6. The Rehearsal Room. Julian didn't sleep that day, despite Augustine's suggestion, despite an exhaustion that had settled by mid-morning into a dull, persistent hum behind his eyes. He lay on top of his bedcovers fully dressed, curtains open to a gray sky he couldn't bring himself to shut out, and ran the rooftop conversation over and over until the words began to lose their shape the way a phrase repeated too many times eventually stops sounding like language at all. Somewhere around noon, he gave up on the pretense of rest entirely and sat instead at the small kitchen table that served as his desk, his laptop open in front of him, telling himself he was simply organizing his thoughts. What he was actually doing, he admitted to himself eventually, was looking for Annika Kovac. It took him less than 10 minutes. A small architecture firm 2 states over, 3 employees, a modest website with a portfolio of renovated farmhouses, and a single sun-drenched community library. A short biography mentioned her father only once, in the kind of careful, formal language people used when they hadn't yet found a way to talk about grief without performing it. Annika lost her father, Frederick Kovac, in redacted year. She dedicates her continuing work in community design to the values he instilled in her. There was a single public statement from 8 months earlier, posted to the firm's otherwise dormant social media account, thanking well-wishers and asking, politely, for privacy. Julian read it 3 times and then closed the laptop, feeling, the entire time, like a man trespassing somewhere far more private than any locked archive in the Aurelian sublevel. He thought about what it would mean to know, with total certainty, that the version of your father's death you'd grieved for 8 months was not the true one, that somewhere behind a wall in a hotel penthouse, in a city she'd probably never visited, the actual last moments of his life had played out in a room built to fake exactly that outcome for someone else's benefit. He thought about whether knowing the truth would be a mercy to her or simply a second wound layered over the first, and found he didn't have an answer, and that the not having an answer bothered him more than almost anything else that had happened in the past week. He arrived at the hotel that evening earlier than his shift required and found Priya already in the staff break room. 2 cups of coffee on the table in front of her, one of which she slid toward him as he sat down. "You look like you didn't sleep either," she said. "I kept thinking about the daughter," Julian admitted. "Kovacs. I don't even know her, and I can't stop thinking about her. Her name's Annika," he added, before Priya could ask. "I looked her up. I shouldn't have, probably. It felt like trespassing the whole time I was doing it, and I did it anyway." Priya studied him over the rim of her cup for a long moment, her expression careful, weighing something. "You're not going to be able to leave this alone now, are you? Whatever happens with Imogen tonight, even if she has a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of it, even if Augustine's version turns out to be the honest one, start to finish, you're still going to think about Annika Kovac every time you walk past that archive door." "Probably," Julian admitted. "I don't know what to do with that yet. You don't have to know tonight. You just have to walk into that office and ask her the truth. The rest can come after." He nodded, though the prospect sat heavy in his chest, a stone he hadn't asked to carry and couldn't now set down. They spent the next hour at the desk in the ordinary rhythm of the job, a late check-in for a couple celebrating an anniversary, complete with a bottle of champagne Julian arranged to be waiting in their room. A request for extra pillows that turned, predictably, into a request for an entirely different pillow firmness 20 minutes later, a question about breakfast service hours that he answered 3 separate times for 3 separate guests who had apparently all decided, independently, that the concierge was more reliable than the information card sitting in plain view on their own desks. The mundane texture of the work felt, that night, almost unbearably strange. A performance laid carefully over a life that had quietly, irreversibly, stopped being simple sometime in the last 8 days. It was nearly 10 when the elevator chimed and Imogen herself stepped into the lobby, dressed not in her usual tailored daywear but in something softer, A dark cardigan over slacks, the kind of clothing a person wore when they didn't expect to be seen by anyone who mattered to their professional image. She crossed to the desk directly, and Julian understood, before she'd said a single word, exactly what Augustine must have told her, and when. "Walk with me," she said. It wasn't a request. She led him not to her office, but out through the side entrance, onto the narrow service terrace that ran along the hotel's east wing, overlooking the same interior light well, where the 9th-floor stairwell window looked into the penthouse from below. The night air was cold and smelled of salt and diesel from the harbor, and far below them the water stretched out dark and glittering, container ships sitting at anchor, like sleeping animals waiting for morning. "Augustine tells me he took you both up to the roof," she said, leaning against the railing, not quite looking at him yet. "I should be angry with him. I find, mostly, that I'm relieved. I've watched you carry this for over a week now, Julian, and some part of me has been waiting to see whether you'd come find me, or whether you'd go straight to the authorities instead, and simply let the consequences land where they landed. Why does it matter which? Because it tells me what kind of man you actually are, underneath 11 years of doing this job extremely well." She turned to face him then, and in the dim terrace light her expression held none of the careful, managed warmth he'd seen across her desk a week earlier. Something more exposed now, more tired, more genuinely human than he'd ever seen on her. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending Augustine's version of this was complete. It wasn't, and it couldn't have been. He told you the truth as he understands it, which is the truth of a man who loved Constantine Albrecht deeply and has spent 30 years protecting that love from anything that might complicate it. I'd like to tell you the rest, if you'll let me." "Go on." "Constantine Albrecht did help people. I won't pretend otherwise to you. I was one of them, a very long time ago, in circumstances I'm still not ready to describe to anyone currently on my payroll, and I owe him a debt I've spent my entire career trying to repay in the only currency he ever truly valued, which was discretion." She paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "But by the time I inherited this from him, I'd also inherited his blind spots, fully formed, without ever realizing it until it was far too late to do anything but live with them. He believed, fervently, almost religiously, that he could look at a person across a desk and know the difference between someone worth saving and someone simply running from consequences they'd earned and deserved to face. He was wrong about that more often than he ever admitted, even to himself, even at the very end. I've made the same mistake since. Kovac is the clearest example of it. He isn't the only one. How many others? 3, in the year since I took this over, where I made a judgment call I shouldn't have made, where the file in front of me told one story and the person sitting across from me was quietly telling another. The only reason none of those 3 ended the way Kovac's did is luck, Julian, not wisdom, and I'd be lying to you if I claimed otherwise." She said this plainly, without flinching from it, and Julian found himself, despite everything, respecting the unflinching honesty of it even as it deepened the unease sitting in his chest. "I tell you this because I want you to understand precisely what you'd be inheriting if you ever chose to stay close to this. Not a noble secret operation quietly saving the desperate from cruel and undeserved fates, though it has been exactly that, more than once, in ways I'll always be proud of. A flawed, dangerous thing, run by flawed and frightened people who are doing their genuine best and occasionally, catastrophically, failing, a thing that has cost more, at least once, than any of us were ever prepared to pay." Julian was quiet for a long moment, watching the harbor lights tremble against the black water below. "Augustine said you've had your eye on me. that what happened that first night wasn't an accident. Imogen's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, he thought, but something closer to resignation, the particular look of a person finally admitting aloud to a thing they'd hoped to delay admitting for a little while longer. You're observant in a way I haven't encountered in a member of my staff in a very long time, she said. 11 years here, and in that time you've noticed perhaps 100 small things you never once mentioned to anyone, because some instinct in you understood that genuine hospitality means knowing precisely when not to speak. That instinct is rare, Julian. Rarer than you probably realize. Working inside it every night without anything to compare it against. It's exactly what this work requires. Someone who can see everything in front of them and choose, deliberately, carefully, what to actually do with what they've seen. I've watched you for 3 years, quietly, deciding whether you might be capable of carrying something considerably heavier than guest preferences and room assignments and noise complaints from the 7th floor. So the penthouse that night. The window I happened to be looking through at exactly the wrong moment. Was not an accident, no. She held his gaze steadily, refusing to let it soften into something gentler than the truth deserved. I scheduled you to that floor that night, knowing the rehearsal was happening, knowing the curtain gap existed and had always existed, genuinely wondering, not cruelly, Julian, whatever else you take from this conversation, please believe that part, whether you would notice and what you would choose to do once you had.
It was a test.
I won't apologize for the fact of it because I think, in some strange and admittedly self-serving way, it was also a kind of respect. I wanted to know whether you were the kind of person this work could eventually be entrusted to before I ever risked asking you outright and being wrong about the answer. You let me think I might be losing my mind. I let you sit with uncertainty for a week. Yes, because I needed to see what you'd do with it. Whether you'd let it go quietly, the way 99 people in 100 would, grateful for the easy explanation. Whether you'd build a careful, methodical case on your own, and eventually bring it to me directly, which is more or less what you did, though Augustine's conscience beat you to the telling by a single night. Or whether your nerve would hold long enough to walk straight to the police the moment you had enough to be believed. She paused, and something almost like genuine discomfort crossed her face. I'm not proud of how cold that sounds, said aloud, standing here, at 10 o'clock at night. I want you to know that much, at least. But I'd rather be entirely honest with you about the calculation I made than pretend, even now, that there wasn't one. And if I go to the police tonight, with everything I currently know, something flickered across her face. Not fear exactly, Julian thought, but a kind of weary, rehearsed readiness, the expression of a woman who had clearly imagined this particular question many times before tonight ever arrived. Then 40 years of work ends. A great deal of it good, genuinely good, and some of it not, and I won't pretend the ledger sorts neatly into those 2 columns. A number of people currently rebuilding lives under names that were never legally theirs will be found, exposed, and very possibly endangered by the exact people they paid a great deal of money to escape in the first place. Augustine will almost certainly go to prison for what happened with Kovac, regardless of how much of that night's decisions were truly his to make alone. I expect I will as well, eventually one way or another. None of that is a threat, Julian.
I want to be entirely clear about that.
It's simply the honest shape of the consequence, and I think you're owed a clear account of it before you decide anything at all. He looked out at the harbor for a long while, turning the full weight of it over in his mind. Annika Kovac's quiet, formal public statement asking for privacy after a death that had never happened the way she'd been allowed to believe it had. Augustine's 31 years of complicated loyalty finally cracking open on a rooftop at dawn. Imogen herself, standing in front of him now without any of the careful, managed warmth she usually wielded so effortlessly, simply a tired and frightened woman waiting to learn, finally, what kind of man he actually intended to be. "There's a guest checking in this week," he said finally. "Achterberg. Is his arrangement still moving forward?" "Friday," Imogen said. "Final stage of the protocol." "And if I asked you to stop it? Just that one? Not the whole archive, not 40 years of other people's choices. Just this one decision here, now." She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not capitulation, not quite, but a kind of careful, genuine curiosity, as though he'd asked precisely the question she'd been quietly hoping he might think to ask all along. "Why that one, specifically?" "Because it's the one I can still actually affect," Julian said. "I can't undo what happened to Kovac. I can't give Annika back the conversation she never got to have with her father before he died, believing whatever he believed in that room. But Achterberg is still here. Still real, still breathing, still capable of choosing something else if someone makes him look at it honestly. If there's any part of this you genuinely let me be part of, rather than simply test from a careful distance, I wanted to start there. Not with abstract trust. With one decision I actually get to help make before Friday." Imogen was quiet for a long moment, the harbor wind pulling loose strands of gray-streaked hair from her chignon, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual careful authority, replaced by something that sounded, for the first time since Julian had known her, almost like genuine uncertainty about how the rest of this would go. "All right," she said. "Come to my office tomorrow night. Bring whatever questions you still have about Achterberg's file, and don't soften them for my benefit. I'll show you everything, the original request, the reasoning behind our approval, the risk assessment we ran before any of this was set in motion. You can tell me, honestly, plainly, whether you believe we're about to make the same mistake we made with Kovac. And then we'll decide, together, what actually happens on Friday." It wasn't trust, not yet, not fully. Julian understood that even as he nodded his agreement, understood that Imogen was still managing him in some careful fashion, even in the act of appearing to relinquish a measure of control. But it was more than he'd had an hour earlier, and as they walked back together toward the service entrance, the harbor fog beginning its slow nightly crawl up from the water below to wrap itself once more around the old stone of the Aurelian, Julian found himself thinking that perhaps the only honest way through any of this was not to wait for some final moment when he trusted her completely, but simply to keep asking the next true question, and the one after that, for as long as it took, until the answers either held together under the weight of all of it, or finally, irrevocably, came apart. Chapter 7. The Continuity Ledger. The file on Desmond Achterberg sat in a plain manila folder on Imogen's desk the following evening, unremarkable in every way except for the small embossed mark in its upper corner, a single stylized key, the same symbol Julian had begun to notice elsewhere in the building once he knew to look for it, worked discreetly into the brass fixtures of the penthouse elevator, etched faintly into the spine of the unmarked ledger downstairs. He hadn't asked what it meant yet. He suspected, sitting down across from Imogen in the lamp-lit office, that he was about to find out. "Before you open it," Imogen said, "I want you to understand the shape of the decision you're being asked to weigh in on. This isn't a vote. I'm not interested in democratizing 40 years of judgment calls overnight. But I told you I'd let you see the reasoning, and I intend to keep that word. I appreciate that. Don't yet." You might not, once you've read it. She slid the folder across the desk. Read it the way you'd read a guest complaint. Look for what's missing as much as what's there. Julian opened the folder. The first page was a typed summary, clearly compiled by Imogen herself or someone working closely under her direction, clean, clinical, almost legal in its phrasing. Desmond Achterberg, 47, founder and former chief executive of a regional investment firm that had, over the past 18 months, been quietly unwinding under the weight of an SEC investigation into a series of client accounts that had been systematically misrepresented to cover losses from a failed real estate venture. The investigation had not yet gone public. An indictment, according to a source the file didn't name, was expected within the month. Achterberg's assets had been moved slowly and carefully over the preceding year, some into his wife's name, some offshore, a portion, Julian noted with a small cold jolt, routed through the same Meridian Asset Services account Priya had traced to the post office box 2 blocks from the hotel. He's been planning this for over a year, Julian said.
Most of them have.
The desperate, impulsive cases, the ones who walk in off the street in genuine crisis, are rarer than you'd think. Most people who reach this point have been quietly preparing for months before they ever sit across from me. Julian turned the page. The next section was titled, simply, Risk Assessment, and beneath it a series of bullet points Julian read twice, slowly, feeling something in his chest tighten with each line. Subject demonstrates limited remorse regarding affected clients. 3 sessions with intake counselor produced minimal acknowledgement of harm caused. Subject consistently reframes the situation as a business decision that didn't pay off, rather than fraud. Subject's primary stated motivation for relocation is avoidance of consequence rather than genuine desire for reform. Subject has expressed intention to resume similar investment activity under new identity within 18 months. He told you he intends to do it again, Julian said, looking up. It's right here in your own file. He told the intake counselor that, yes, under a different phrasing, but the meaning was unmistakable. Imogen's expression didn't change, didn't flinch from the weight of what she was admitting. I read this assessment myself. I approved him anyway. Why? Because the fee he offered was large enough to fund this archive's operating costs for the next 4 years, including the legal retainer that keeps Meridian functioning as a credible holding entity, including the discretionary payments that keep certain people in certain offices from looking too closely at certain things. I told myself the money would be used to help 3 or 4 genuinely deserving cases down the line. I told myself a man with no remorse and a stated intention to reoffend was still, technically, within the bounds of what this service has always done, given people a second chance, regardless of whether they deserved a first. Julian sat back in his chair, the folder open in his lap, and felt something settle into place that had been circling at the edges of his understanding since the rooftop conversation with Augustine. This is exactly what happened with Kovac, isn't it? Not the heart attack. The decision before it. You knew something about him that should have given you pause, and the money outweighed it. Imogen was quiet for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice had gone very steady, very careful, the voice of someone forcing herself to say a true thing she would have preferred to leave unsaid. Kovac's assessment used almost identical language, she said. I went back and reread it the week after he died. Limited remorse. Primary motivation avoidance rather than reform. I told myself at the time that it didn't matter, that this service was never meant to be a moral reward system, that the desperate woman fleeing her husband and the fraudster fleeing prosecution were, in the narrowest sense, equally entitled to a second chance, because who was I to decide whose suffering counted and whose didn't? It's a comfortable thing to believe, Julian. It lets you take any fee that walks through the door and call it consistency rather than greed. And now I have a dead man in a ledger with a red next to his name, and a daughter who believes a story I built for her, and I no longer find the comfortable belief quite so comfortable. She met his eyes directly. I should have stopped Achterberg's case the moment I saw this assessment. I didn't, because the protocol was already in motion, because the money was already committed, because some part of me, the part Augustine's been protecting for 30 years without ever quite admitting it to himself, still believes the operation needs to keep running no matter the cost of any single case within it. I want you to tell me, honestly, whether you think that belief has finally curdled into something I can't see clearly from inside it anymore. It was, Julian understood, the most genuinely vulnerable thing Imogen Castellane had said to him in 11 years of working under her. Not a confession extracted under pressure, but an actual question, asked because she didn't trust her own judgment to answer it alone anymore. He thought of the rehearsal room behind the penthouse wall panel, the prop blood and theatrical makeup he hadn't yet had the chance to examine closely. He thought of Achterberg's flushed, irritated face in the doorway that first night, the practiced ease of a man performing innocence for an audience he hadn't expected. He thought, most of all, of the cold, clinical language in the file in his lap, intention to resume similar investment activity within 18 months, and felt the decision settle into something close to clarity. I think you already know what I'm going to say, he said. I think that's why you showed me the file instead of just telling me you'd already decided to stop it. Something that might have been relief, or might have been simple exhaustion, passed across Imogen's face. Tell me anyway. I'd rather hear it from someone who isn't protecting 40 years of their own choices. Stop it, Julian said. Not because he doesn't deserve a second chance. I don't think that's actually the question, whatever Albrecht believed. Stop it because you already know, in writing, in your own assessment, that giving him one won't actually change anything except where he's standing when he does it again. That's not a second chance. That's relocation with extra steps, and you're charging people millions of dollars to participate in your own institutional doubt about whether any of this still works the way it used to. Imogen absorbed that in silence for a long moment, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had steadied into something that sounded, for the first time, like a decision rather than a question. I'll cancel Friday, she said. I'll have to find a way to do it that doesn't expose the operation to him. A man like Achterberg doesn't take rejection quietly, and the last thing any of us need is a furious indicted fraudster with intimate knowledge of how this works deciding to make trouble out of spite. But I'll cancel it. She looked at Julian for a long moment. You understand this doesn't resolve Kovac. It doesn't undo what happened in that room 8 months ago, or what Augustine and I did afterward to cover it. It's one decision about one man going forward. The larger question: what happens to this archive, to Augustine, to me, to 40 years of other people's quiet new lives, that's still entirely unresolved? I know, Julian said. I'm not asking you to resolve all of it tonight. I'm asking for what I can actually do something about. The rest of it I haven't figured out yet. Imogen nodded slowly, and for a moment something passed between them that wasn't quite trust but was, Julian thought, perhaps the beginning of it. The particular fragile understanding that comes from two people agreeing, honestly, on one small true thing in the middle of a much larger and more uncertain situation. It was nearly midnight when Julian left her office, and instead of returning directly to the lobby, he found himself walking the long way, down through the East Wing corridor, past the service stairwell with its narrow arched window, the gap in the curtains above still uncorrected after all this time. He stopped there for a moment, looking up at the dark glass, and thought of the 4 seconds that had started all of this. The standing figure, the one on the floor, hands at a throat, a scene he now understood to have been entirely staged, rehearsed, performed for an audience of exactly no one who was supposed to be watching. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps behind him, light and quick, and turned to find Priya coming down the corridor with an expression he didn't recognize on her. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of urgent focus that told him she'd been looking for him. "I found something," she said, "in the digital records while you were upstairs. I wasn't trying to keep digging, I swear. I was just cross-referencing the guest list for tomorrow night against past penthouse stays, habit at this point, and..." She stopped herself, visibly forcing her voice to slow down. "There's another name. Coming in tomorrow. Same pattern. Drink order, window seat, the departure note. Except this one's different." "Different how?" "It's not a stranger." Priya held out her phone, the registry entry glowing on the screen. "Julian, it's someone who worked here 3 years ago. A concierge, the position before you took it over. Marcus Reyes. He left suddenly. I remember it, vaguely. I was new. Everyone said he'd taken a job somewhere overseas, and nobody heard from him again." She looked up at him, and Julian felt the cold certainty of what she was about to say arrive a half-second before she said it. What if he didn't leave for a job overseas? What if he's a former version of you? What if you're not the first person they've groomed for this, and Reyes is what happens to the ones who don't make it all the way through? Julian stared at the screen, at the booking confirmation under a name that wasn't Marcus Reyes, a new name, a new identity already half built around him for a return engagement neither of them had been told to expect. And felt the careful, fragile understanding he'd just reached with Imogen begin, almost immediately, to feel considerably less complete than it had 10 minutes earlier. "We need to find out what happened to him," Julian said quietly, "before he checks in tomorrow. And we need to ask Imogen why she never once mentioned, in everything she told you tonight, that you weren't the first person she'd tried this with." Above them, through the narrow arched window, the fog had begun its slow nightly drift back and off the harbor, soft and patient, wrapping itself around the Aurelian the way it had every night for 93 years, indifferent, as it had always been, to the small and large reckonings unfolding quietly behind its old stone walls. Chapter 8. The Audition. Marcus Reyes arrived at the Aurelian a little after 9 the following evening, and Julian, watching from behind the front desk, felt the strange vertigo of recognizing a stranger's face from descriptions alone. He was a man in his late 30s, lean, dark-haired, dressed with the particular understated precision of someone who had once worked in hospitality himself and never quite lost the habit of dressing for it. A charcoal overcoat that fit too well to be off the rack, shoes polished to the specific dull shine that came from someone who'd once been taught, professionally, exactly how guests judged a man by his footwear before he'd said a single word. He checked in under the name Daniel Marsh, paid with a card that traced, Julian had no doubt, back to another shell account buried somewhere in the same tangle of holding companies as Meridian Asset Services, and crossed the lobby toward the elevator bank with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who had walked through this exact space many times before, though as far as the current registry was concerned, Daniel Marsh had never once set foot in this building. "That's him," Priya murmured, coming to stand beside Julian at the desk, her voice pitched low enough not to carry across the marble. "I found a staff photo from 3 years ago. buried in the old employee newsletter archive, the kind nobody updates anymore, just sitting on an internal drive collecting dust. It's grainier than I'd like. He's heavier in the face, younger looking around the eyes. But it's him. He doesn't look like a man being coerced into anything, Julian said, watching the elevator doors close behind him. He looks comfortable, like a man coming home rather than a man being summoned somewhere against his will. No, Priya agreed slowly, something troubled settling into her voice. That's exactly what worries me about it.
They didn't approach him that night.
Julian understood, with the particular instinct 11 years of reading guests had given him, that a direct approach in the lobby would accomplish nothing except alerting whoever might be watching, Imogen, or someone else entirely, someone whose existence he hadn't yet had reason to suspect, that they'd noticed the pattern before they were meant to. Instead, he spent the following day doing the quieter, more patient work he'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 weeks. Searching not guest records this time, but personnel files, the kind kept not in the leather ledgers downstairs, but in the hotel's ordinary human resources archive, 3 floors above the lobby in a windowless room that required, fortunately, only the same master key he'd already used once before to let himself into Imogen's office. Marcus Reyes's file was thinner than he'd expected, the paperwork of a man's entire professional history compressed into a folder no thicker than a guest's single-stay invoice. A standard application, 2 references that read like every other reference Julian had ever seen attached to a hospitality hire, a performance review from his final year that praised his discretion and attention to detail in language so similar to commendations Julian had received himself. Exceptional capacity to anticipate guest needs without being asked, maintains appropriate professional distance even in situations requiring significant trust, that he felt a genuine chill reading it, the specific discomfort of recognizing yourself in another man's obituary. The termination note, dated just over 3 years earlier, was a single clipped line, resigned voluntarily. No exit interview conducted per employee request. Forwarding address withheld at employee's request. It was the absence that told him more than the content ever could. No exit interview, in a building where even housekeeping staff were given a formal sit-down conversation upon leaving, complete with a card signed by the entire department. No forwarding address, in an industry that prided itself on maintaining lifelong professional networks, on the assumption that today's departing concierge might be tomorrow's general manager somewhere else worth knowing. A man who had simply stopped existing within the hotel's records on a specific date, in precisely the same fashion, Julian now understood with a creeping certainty that dozens of guests had stopped existing within their own former lives over the preceding decades. He found Priya in the break room that evening, the thin file spread between them under the harsh fluorescent light, and together they pieced apart what the paper trail seemed to suggest, building the shape of it the way they'd built every other piece of this together, slowly, carefully, checking each inference against the other before letting it stand. He was being groomed, Julian said. The same way I'm apparently being groomed. The performance language, the timeline. 2 years of slow advancement, more responsibility than his title technically called for. It's the same pattern Imogen described to me on the terrace. And then he just stops. Disappears from the records entirely, the same week his employment ends. Priya tapped the termination note. Whatever happened, it happened fast. There's no gradual transition here, no notice period, nothing that looks like an ordinary resignation. This looks like someone who needed to be gone within days, not weeks. We have to ask her, Priya said finally, closing the folder. Tonight. before whatever's happening with Reyes goes any further than it already has. Julian found Imogen in her office a little after 11, the desk lamp throwing its familiar warm pool of light across the dark oak, and this time he didn't wait to be invited to sit. He laid the personnel file open on the desk in front of her, turned to the termination page, and watched her face for whatever it would reveal before she had the chance to compose an answer for him. What it told him, in the half-second before her expression settled back into its usual careful stillness, was recognition, immediate, unguarded, the look of someone confronted unexpectedly with a memory they had genuinely hoped never to have to discuss again. "Marcus," she said quietly, and something in the single word carried more weight than Julian had expected, something closer to grief than to caution. He checked in last night, under the name Daniel Marsh. Same pattern as Achterberg, as Vance, as every other case in that ledger downstairs. The drink order, the window seat, the Thursday departure note already logged before he'd even unpacked. Julian sat down across from her without being asked. "I want to know why you never once mentioned he existed. In 2 weeks of conversations where you kept telling me how much you valued being honest with me." Imogen was quiet for a long moment, her hands folding together on the desk in the precise gesture Julian had come to recognize as her preparing to say something she found genuinely, personally difficult to say aloud. "Because I hoped I wouldn't have to," she admitted finally. "Marcus was the first person I ever tried this with. Before I'd refined any of it into something I could even pretend to call a careful process. I saw the same qualities in him that I later saw in you. The watchfulness, the instinctive discretion, the particular gift for noticing everything in a room without ever once being the thing other people noticed in return. I groomed him for nearly 2 years before I finally told him what this building actually was underneath its surface, and I told him badly. All at once. Too much. Too fast. With none of the patience I've at least tried to extend to you." How did he react? "He was horrified," Imogen said simply, and there was real pain in the admission, old pain, worn smooth by years of carrying it quietly. Not at the morality of it precisely. He understood, eventually, the way you've come to understand, that it was more complicated than simple criminality dressed up in good linens. He was horrified at himself. At having spent 2 years of his life being quietly, deliberately shaped into something without his full knowledge or genuine consent. He felt used, Julian. He wasn't wrong to feel that way. I'd made exactly the calculation with him that I later made with you, testing, withholding, revealing only what served my purposes at any given moment, and I made it again 3 years later, without learning a single thing from how catastrophically it had gone the first time. So he left. He asked to leave.
Completely.
Entirely, not simply the hotel, but the city, his name, every thread that connected him to any of it, because he was terrified that merely knowing what he knew made him a liability to us, and made us, by extension, a danger to him. She paused, her gaze drifting briefly to the dark window behind her, the fog pressing soft against the glass. I granted the request. It seemed, at the time, like the only decent thing left for me to offer a man I genuinely wronged. I gave him a new identity, the same service we extend to clients, extended instead to someone who'd been hurt by the operation itself rather than helped by it. I told myself it was restitution, a way of closing the wound I'd opened. I'm not entirely certain, even now, sitting here telling you this, that it wasn't simply one more way of making sure he stayed quiet. Julian sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling differently in him than he'd expected. Not quite anger, not quite sympathy, something uncomfortably suspended between the two. And now he's back, checking into the same hotel under a different invented name, going through the exact same protocol.
Why?
I don't know, Imogen admitted, and for the first time genuine uncertainty entered her voice, cracking through the careful composure she'd maintained even through the hardest parts of what she'd just confessed. I haven't approved a new case for him. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years, not once, not even to confirm he was safe. If he's here, it isn't through any channel I authorized, which means either he came back entirely on his own, or someone brought him back without my knowledge. She reached for the phone on her desk and dialed an internal extension, her fingers, Julian noticed, very slightly less steady than they had been a moment ago. Augustine, she said, when the call connected. I need you to pull everything you have on the guest in room 1140, registered as Daniel Marsh. Tonight.
Now, not in the morning.
She set the receiver down and looked at Julian, and for the first time since this had all begun 2 weeks earlier, he saw something on her face that looked unmistakably, unguardedly like fear. Not the careful, managed concern she'd shown him across this same desk during their first conversation, gently suggesting fog and fatigue, but something raw, something closer to the bone. If Marcus came back on his own, she said quietly, almost to herself, without going through me, without going through any version of the protocol I'd recognize, that tells me one of two things. Either he's in some kind of trouble desperate enough that he risked everything. His new life, his new name, 3 years of careful distance, to come back to the one place he swore to me he'd never set foot in again.
Or...
She didn't finish the sentence, but Julian understood, with a cold certainty that settled through him like the harbor fog gathering outside the window, exactly what the unfinished half of it implied. Or someone else brought him back, he said. Someone who knows this protocol well enough to use it against the very people who built it. Imogen's phone rang again before she could answer, sharp and sudden in the quiet office, and Julian watched her face change as she picked it up and listened, the careful composure cracking, just slightly, into something he hadn't seen on her before in 2 weeks of watching her manage crisis after crisis with apparently effortless authority. He's gone, she said, setting the receiver down slowly, her voice gone flat with shock. Augustine says the room is empty. The bed's untouched. According to the front desk and elevator cameras, he checked in, went up to the 11th floor, and apparently never came back down, but he's not in the room. There's no record of him leaving through any monitored exit, and Augustine's already checked the service stairwells twice. Like the penthouse, Julian said quietly. Like the rehearsal I saw that first night. Like the penthouse, Imogen agreed, and for the first time since Julian had known her, standing in her office with the harbor fog pressing gray and patient against the windows, he saw genuine fear settle fully and permanently into her expression. The particular fear of someone who had spent decades believing she understood every secret her own hotel was capable of holding, and was only now, finally, beginning to suspect that something, or someone, inside it had quietly learned to keep secrets even from her. Get Priya, she said, already rising from her chair, reaching for the cardigan draped over the back of it. And get Augustine up here the moment he's finished checking the 11th floor. I think it's time the 4 of us went back into that archive together. Not just the cases I've personally approved, Julian, but every single entry, going back to the very beginning, because I am no longer entirely certain I know who else has been using this building's particular gift for making people disappear, or for what purpose, or for how long this has been happening without my knowledge. She moved past him toward the door, and Julian followed, the weight of everything they'd uncovered over the past 2 weeks suddenly reorganizing itself around this new, unsettling possibility that the careful, contained mystery he believed himself to be solving might in fact be only the visible edge of something considerably larger. Something that had been operating in the building's blind spots for longer than even its own general manager had understood. Chapter 9. What the Fog Hides. The four of them gathered in the sublevel archive a little before 1 a.m. Julian, Priya, Augustine still breathing heavily from his search of the 11th floor, his collar damp with sweat despite the chill of the basement air, and Imogen, who arrived last, carrying a small brass key Julian hadn't seen before, worn smooth and dark with age. The kind of key that had clearly spent decades being touched by only one hand at a time across several owners. "There's a section of this I never showed either of you," she said, kneeling beside the desk and fitting the key into a drawer set low in its frame, half hidden by the desk's heavy legs. Inside, beneath a false bottom that lifted away with a soft, well-oiled click, lay a second, slimmer ledger, its leather darker than the others on the shelves, its pages fewer, its spine less worn from handling. Personnel cases. People who came close enough to this work to need watching afterward, the way Marcus needs watching now. I keep it separate from the client records because it isn't business in the same sense. It's mine to carry, in a way the rest of this archive technically isn't. She set it on the desk under the green-shaded lamp, and the four of them leaned in together, shoulders nearly touching in the cramped space, as she opened it to the first page. The entries were sparse. Julian counted 6 in total, spread across what appeared to be nearly 15 years, each one a name, a date, and a brief notation in Imogen's own careful hand describing not a destination, the way the client ledger did, but an outcome, a verdict, a final accounting. Reyes M. Declined. Relocated for safety. Status. Monitored. Quarterly check-in. Last contact 11 months ago. Whitfield S. Declined. Relocated. Status. Monitored. Contact lost after 4th year.
A concours D.
Accepted partial role. Withdrew after 18 months. Status. Relocated. Contact maintained. Castellane I. Not applicable. Julian's eyes caught on the last entry and stayed there, his mind needing a moment to fully process what he was reading. "This is you." "It is," Imogen said quietly, not looking away from the page. "Albrecht kept this same ledger before I inherited any of it. I'm the first entry, technically, though he never wrote anything beside my own name except those 2 initials. I used to think he meant it as a private joke between us. The teacher's name belongs at the top of the roll, even if she never graduated the class the same way the others eventually did. I haven't found it especially funny in a long time." "Whitfield," Priya said softly, her finger resting beside the second name on the page, as though touching it more firmly might force it to explain itself. "Contact lost after the 4th year. What does that actually mean? Lost how exactly?" Imogen's expression tightened, the lamp light carving deeper shadows beneath her eyes than Julian had noticed even an hour earlier. "It means precisely what it says, and I wish it meant less. We monitor relocated personnel quietly, the same courtesy we extend to certain client cases requiring ongoing discretion after their own relocation. Not surveillance, nothing invasive, simply a quarterly verification that the person is alive, safe, and not in any position that might expose what they know." Sarah Whitfield's contact simply stopped 1 quarter, for years into the arrangement. No warning, no final message. I assumed at the time that she'd built a life solid enough she no longer felt the need to maintain the connection to us. People do that, eventually, the successful ones especially. I never pursued it further than a handful of unanswered calls. I should have. I understand that now in a way I clearly didn't 4 years ago. You're telling me there are at least 2 people, Whitfield and now possibly Marcus, who walked away from this archive with full knowledge of exactly how it works, Julian said slowly, and you have no current idea where either of them actually is or has been for years. Yes, Imogen admitted, the single word costing her something visible. And you're only telling us this now, tonight, after Marcus walked into a guest room under a false name and apparently vanished from every monitored exit in this building. She didn't answer right away. It was Augustine who finally broke the silence, his voice rough with something Julian recognized, uncomfortably, as guilt long carried, and only now being set down. There's something else, he said. Something I should have told you both on the roof days ago, and didn't, because I genuinely hoped to God it wouldn't end up mattering. The 3 of them turned toward him. He was standing slightly apart from the desk, angled toward the shelving as though he'd rather be looking at almost anything else in the room than their faces. Whitfield wasn't just a failed protege who walked away clean, he said. She was the one who trained Wren. The name landed in the small stone chamber with a weight Julian felt settle into his chest before his conscious mind had fully caught up to why it mattered so much. Wren Cabrillo, he said slowly. The woman from the bar. The one who's present at every single staged disappearance we've documented. Wren's real name was never Cabrillo, any more than Marcus's real name is currently Daniel Marsh, Augustine said. She came through the same intake process the 2 of you have been put through, watched first, tested quietly, brought in slowly over months rather than all at once. Sarah Whitfield trained her personally, taught her the protocols, the scripts, the careful way of moving through a crowded room so that nobody quite remembers your face clearly an hour later. When Whitfield's contact went dark 4 years ago, Wren was already fully operational on her own, already running cases without needing anyone standing over her shoulder. I told myself, because it was a great deal easier than the alternative, that whatever happened to Whitfield was simply an unrelated coincidence of timing. 2 unconnected things that happened to occur in the same year. You don't actually believe that, Imogen said. It wasn't a question, and her voice carried no real accusation in it, only a tired certainty. No, Augustine admitted. The word dragged out of him. Haven't believed it in a long while, if I'm honest with myself, which I haven't always been particularly good at where this place is concerned. I think Wren found some way to make Whitfield's disappearance permanent rather than simply quiet. I think she's been running her own parallel version of this archive for years now, alongside the one we believed we were the only ones controlling, using cases we never approved, clients we never properly assessed, protocols she learned at our hands and has since refined and sharpened well past anything Albrecht or you ever intended them to become. Julian thought of the woman in the dark green dress raising her glass to him across the lobby bar, that small, knowing, almost amused smile, the unmistakable sense he'd had even in that first encounter that she recognized him as something more than an ordinary member of staff doing an ordinary job. She knows I've been watching all of this. She's known since the very first night, possibly even before that. She'd have to have known, Priya said slowly, working it through aloud. If she's the one actually running the operational, hands-on side of these cases, she'd have known about Achterberg's rehearsal before any of us did, including Imogen. She might even have been the second figure in that room the night you saw it through the stairwell window. Not hotel staff helping Achterberg rehearse his own staged death the way the official protocol describes, but Wren herself, personally demonstrating the choreography to a client who'd never have managed it convincingly without her guidance. Imogen closed the personnel ledger slowly, both hands resting flat against its cover as though to physically hold something in place, and when she finally looked up at the three of them, her face had taken on an expression Julian hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful, practiced composure of a woman skillfully managing a difficult conversation from a position of authority, but something rawer underneath it, the look of someone realizing, in real time, in front of witnesses, that ground she had believed entirely solid beneath her feet had in fact been quietly eroding for years without her ever once noticing the shift. If Wren has genuinely been running parallel cases, she said very slowly, as though saying it out loud were the only way to test whether she could actually bear the weight of it, using our tunnels, our protocols, our staff training, all of it, without ever bringing a single one of those cases through proper assessment, then Kovac isn't the only death sitting somewhere unaccounted for in all of this. It means I have no real idea how many other names belong in that red dot column of the master ledger. It means the operation I have spent 13 years believing I personally controlled, start to finish, has in fact been running half outside my knowledge for at least 4 of those years, possibly longer. "We need to find Marcus," Julian said, the urgency in his own voice surprising him. "Tonight. Now, before whatever's currently happening to him finishes happening. If Wren brought him back here against his will, without your approval, there's a reason for it, and given everything we've just learned, I don't think it's a kind one." "The tunnels," Augustine said suddenly, straightening up so fast his knee cracked audibly against the desk leg. "The old smuggling passages. They run from beneath this very archive all the way down to a service door near the harbor wall. Albrecht's father used them to move liquor in the 20s, and we've used the same network since for exactly this purpose, moving clients quietly out of the building without anyone seeing them cross the lobby or pass a single monitored exit. If Wren is running her own private operation, that's almost certainly where she'd be keeping him." "Show me," Julian said, already moving toward the door at the far end of the archive he hadn't fully registered on his first visit days earlier. A section of wall paneling that matched the surrounding stone so precisely it would have been entirely invisible to anyone who didn't already know exactly where to look for the seam. Augustine produced a second key from the same heavy ring he'd used to unlock the rooftop door, and the panel swung inward onto a narrow brick passage, lit by bare bulbs strung along the ceiling at long, uneven intervals, several of them flickering, the air immediately colder and danker than the archive above, carrying the unmistakable mineral smell of harbor water seeping somewhere through 90 years of aging mortar. They moved single file, Augustine leading with his flashlight sweeping the uneven floor ahead of them, Priya close behind Julian, Imogen bringing up the rear with the personnel ledger still clutched against her chest as though she couldn't bear to set it down even now. The passage seemed to run on far longer than Julian had expected, curving gently with the contour of the bluff the hotel was built into, until it finally opened into a small stone junction where 3 further tunnels branched away in different directions, each marked with nothing more than a small painted symbol worked into the brick. A stylized key, the same mark Julian had noticed once already in Achterberg's intake file, repeated here at intervals like the building's own private signage system, legible only to those who'd already been let into its meaning. "Which way?" Priya asked, her breath fogging visibly in the cold, close air. Augustine studied the 3 branching passages for a long moment, his flashlight beam moving slowly across each opening in turn. Left leads down to the harbor service door. The most obvious route, the one I'd use myself if I were moving someone quietly off the property. Right curves back up toward the old wine cellar beneath the kitchens, and used for decades now. Mostly storage for things nobody wants to throw away. He paused, his beam settling on the center passage, its darkness somehow deeper than the other two, swallowing the edge of the light almost immediately rather than reflecting any of it back. The center isn't on any map I've ever been given in 31 years here. I've stood at this exact junction more times than I could count and never once gone down that particular passage. Always assumed it was structural, a dead end, support brick, nothing worth the trouble of exploring. Wren wouldn't use a route everyone already knows about, Julian said, looking into that deeper darkness with a certainty that settled in his chest like cold water. She'd use the one nobody ever thought to check. They went left first regardless, methodically, because Augustine insisted it was the route most likely to actually resolve something useful within a reasonable stretch of time, and found, after roughly 100 meters of unbroken brick passage, a heavy steel door that opened onto a narrow service alley behind the hotel's loading dock, the harbor visible just beyond it. Dark water lapping quietly against an old concrete seawall under the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn. No sign of Marcus. No indication that anyone had passed through recently at all. The door's hinges, when Augustine tested them, groaned with a particular stiff resistance of metal that hadn't been moved in a good while. "Not this way," Imogen said, already turning back toward the junction, the ledger still pressed against her chest. "The center passage. It has to be the center." It took them nearly 20 more minutes to navigate it, the tunnel narrower than the other two by a noticeable margin, the ceiling low enough that Augustine had to stoop uncomfortably for most of the distance, the bare bulbs strung along this stretch dimmer and more widely spaced, several of them burned out entirely, leaving long stretches where they walked by flashlight alone, breath visible, footsteps echoing softly against wet brick. The sound of dripping water somewhere ahead growing. Steadily louder until it finally resolved, unmistakably, into the ambient sound of an actual occupied room rather than empty tunnel, and then they rounded a final tight bend and found themselves standing at the threshold of a space none of them had known existed within their own building. It was larger than Julian had expected, a chamber perhaps 30 feet across, clearly once part of the original Prohibition-era smuggling network, its brick walls now lined with the unmistakable equipment of an operation that had nothing whatsoever to do with moving liquor. A long folding table held neat stacks of blank identification templates and a laminating press, several professional cameras mounted on tripods angled toward a plain gray backdrop clearly used for new identity photographs. A second table held cosmetics and prosthetic supplies, theatrical grade, the unmistakable cousin of the materials Julian had already found traces of in the penthouse rehearsal room weeks earlier. And at the far end of the chamber, seated in a folding chair beneath a single working bulb, his hands bound loosely in front of him with what looked, on closer inspection, more like restraint for his own protection than genuine cruel imprisonment, sat Marcus Reyes. Alive, apparently unharmed physically, looking up at the four of them with an expression of weary, deeply complicated relief. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice rough from disuse, addressing Imogen directly, his eyes flicking once toward Julian with obvious recognition before returning to her. "I've been trying to figure out how to get a message to you for 3 days now. Marcus." Imogen crossed the room quickly, dropping to her knees beside the chair to work at the loose restraints with steady, practiced fingers. "What happened?"
Who did this to you?
Ren, he said simply, flexing his wrists once they came free. She found me 8 months ago. Tracked me down through a payment I made to a children's hospital. My daughter needed surgery, and I used a card I genuinely believed was untraceable, but apparently not careful enough. She showed up at my door one evening and told me I had exactly 2 choices. Come back voluntarily and help her with something specific, or she'd quietly expose my current identity to the exact people I'd originally needed protecting from in the first place. His gaze moved to Julian. I assume you're the one she's been watching since. What does she actually want? Julian asked. Marcus studied him for a long moment, clearly already aware of who Julian was, perhaps told to expect this exact gathering eventually. She wants the entire archive, he said, not to expose it to the world, to quietly take it over completely, replace whatever's left of Albrecht's original intentions with something colder, more purely transactional. She's been building her own private client list for years, using the skills this place trained her in, but cases it never approved, charging fees 3 or 4 times what the official protocol charges, keeping every dollar of it for herself. She brought me back specifically because she needed someone with real experience on the legitimate side of this to help forge paperwork that would make her entire shadow operation look, on the surface, completely indistinguishable from the official one. So that if anyone ever did come looking eventually, the full trail would lead straight back here, straight back to all of you, rather than to her. Imogen finished freeing his hands and sat back slowly on her heels, her face gone pale in the dim, uneven light of the single working bulb. She intends to frame us. All of it. Kovac. Every poor judgment call I've ever made in 13 years of running this. She means to make it look as though the entirety of her operation, every cent of it, belongs to me. She's smart enough to understand the distinction matters a great deal, Marcus said quietly. An operator who occasionally makes a bad call under real pressure is one kind of criminal in the eyes of the law and everyone else. An operator who's been quietly running an industrial-scale identity laundering business for pure personal profit, charging desperate people triple rates while letting a man die in a hidden room and then burying the truth of it for 8 months, is an entirely different and far less sympathetic kind. She wants you to be remembered as the second kind, Imogen, once this all finally comes apart. And from everything I've personally watched her build down here over these past 8 months, I think she intends for it to come apart very soon. She told me herself, only 3 nights ago, that she was almost ready. Above them, through a narrow gap in the old brick ceiling that none of them had noticed until that exact moment, a thin gray line of dawn light had begun filtering down into the chamber, and somewhere far beyond it, faint but entirely unmistakable, came the low mournful call of the morning's first foghorn. Patient, indifferent, sounding out across a harbor that had no idea how close the Aurelian's oldest and most carefully guarded secret now stood, after 40 quiet years, to finally, irrevocably coming apart at the seams. Chapter 10. The Last Guest. They found Ren Cabrillo exactly where Julian had somehow known they would, in the penthouse, standing at the wall panel beside the bar, one hand resting against the dark walnut as though she'd been waiting for them, perhaps had been waiting for hours, perhaps had known the moment Marcus's restraints came free that the next several hours of her carefully built plan would have to change shape. She didn't look surprised to see the 4 of them step out of the private elevator together a little after 6 that morning, the sky beyond the penthouse windows finally lightening into the soft gray gold of true dawn over the harbor. If anything, she looked almost relieved, The way a performer looks in the last moments before a curtain rises on a show that has been rehearsed so many times the rehearsal and the performance have stopped feeling like different things. I wondered which of you would find the room first, she said, her voice carrying the same low, unhurried quality Julian remembered from the bar 2 weeks earlier. I'm a little disappointed it took this long, honestly. Augustine, of all people, should have known to check the center tunnel ages ago. You used to be sharper than this. Ren. Imogen's voice was quiet, controlled, though Julian could hear the effort it took her to keep it that way. Marcus is safe. Whatever you intended to accomplish by bringing him back, it's already failed. Has it? Ren tilted her head slightly, studying Imogen with something that might have been genuine curiosity. I don't think it has, actually. I think you're standing here believing you've stopped something, when really you've only confirmed the part of the story I most needed confirmed. What story? Julian said. She turned to look at him directly for the first time, and there was something almost fond in her expression, the way you might look at a student who had finally caught up to a lesson you'd been quietly teaching them for weeks without their knowledge. The story where Imogen Castellane built and ran a criminal operation for 13 years, made catastrophic judgment calls that cost a man his life, covered it up with her head of security's help, and groomed an unwitting employee to eventually inherit the whole rotten machine, Ren said. You've spent 2 weeks gathering exactly the evidence that proves that story, Julian. Every conversation, every ledger entry, every confession on that rooftop. You built the case against her yourself, more thoroughly than I ever could have managed alone. I simply needed you to finish the work before I quietly stepped away from all of it with a clean new identity and several years of carefully diverted client fees, leaving the 4 of you standing here holding everything. The room was silent for a long moment, the soft gray morning light spreading slowly across the carpet, and Julian felt something cold and clarifying settle through him. Not surprise exactly, but the particular vertigo of realizing that a story he'd believed himself to be the protagonist of had, in fact, been someone else's story all along, with him cast in a role he hadn't known he was playing. Sarah Whitfield, Augustine said. What did you do to her? Something flickered across Ren's face at the name. Not guilt, Julian thought, but something closer to genuine grief, quickly suppressed. Sarah trained me, she said. Taught me everything I know about this work, the protocols, the scripts, the particular art of becoming forgettable in a room full of people who are paid to remember faces. And then, 4 years ago, she told me she wanted out entirely, wanted to walk away from all of it, take what she'd saved, disappear properly, the way we'd helped so many clients disappear. I helped her do exactly that. I gave her a new name, a new life, somewhere far from here. I think about her sometimes.
He genuinely does.
But I didn't kill her, if that's the accusation sitting underneath your question, Augustine. I simply let her go, the way none of you ever let me go, the way none of you have ever let anyone go who actually mattered to this place's continued existence. You could have walked away too, Imogen said quietly. I would have let you, the way I let Marcus go, the way I let Sarah go, if that's what you actually wanted. Would you? Ren's voice sharpened, the first real edge entering it. Or would you have done what you did to Marcus, given me a new name and then quietly monitored me for the rest of my life, deciding from your office how much freedom I was actually entitled to? I watched what happened to the people who left this place, Imogen. None of them ever really left. You kept a ledger on every single one of them. You're keeping one on Julian right now in your head, even standing in this room, calculating exactly how much of tonight's events you can afford to let him see. the accusation landed harder than Julian expected, in part because some small, uncomfortable part of him recognized the truth folded inside it. Imogen had, after all, scheduled him to that floor on that specific night, had tested him deliberately, had measured his every reaction across 2 weeks of carefully managed honesty. He looked at her now and saw her flinch, almost imperceptibly, at being named so precisely. "That's not the same as what you've done," Imogen said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Isn't it?" Ren shook her head slowly. "I'm not interested in arguing the philosophy of it with you at 6 in the morning, Imogen. I've made my choice. I have 4 years of client relationships that exist entirely outside your ledger, enough money moved through enough accounts that I could disappear completely and never need any of you again, and a very thorough paper trail, already prepared, showing that every difficult decision made in this archive over the past 13 years was made by you alone, with Augustine's complicity. While I was simply an employee following instructions I didn't fully understand. It's not even untrue, exactly. It's just incomplete in ways that happen to favor me." "And Kovac," Julian said. "Where does he fit into the story you've built?" Something shifted in Ren's expression then, the first crack Julian had seen in her composure since they'd stepped off the elevator. "Kovac's death wasn't supposed to happen," she said, quieter now. "I want that understood. Whatever else you believe about me. I was in that room. I was the one running his rehearsal because Imogen's protocol called for 2 staff members and the second one called in sick that night, and I told her I could handle it alone. I watched his heart give out in real time, watched him stop breathing on the floor of a room built to fake exactly that outcome, and there was nothing I could do that would have looked like anything but exactly what it was. I've carried that for 8 months. I'm not the villain of every part of this, even if I've become the villain of the part that matters to you right now." "Then help us," Priya said suddenly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the room. "If you genuinely believe Imogen's judgment has been compromised, if you genuinely believe something needs to change here, help us fix it instead of burying her under a story that isn't even entirely true." Ren looked at Priya for a long moment, something almost like surprise crossing her face, as though she hadn't expected the offer, or hadn't expected it to come from someone she'd barely registered as a participant in any of this. "It's a little late for that," she said finally. "I've already set things in motion that I can't simply call back. A package arrives at the district attorney's office Monday morning, regardless of what happens in this room tonight. Documents. Names. The shape of the story I just described to you, with enough supporting evidence that no amount of explaining the nuance afterward will fully undo it." She looked at Imogen. "I'm not doing this out of cruelty, whatever you choose to believe about me afterward. I'm doing it because I watched you let a man die and then spend 8 months protecting your own legacy instead of his daughter's right to know the truth. I think you deserve to lose what you've spent 13 years building, the same way Annika Kovac lost something she'll never get back." The room was quiet for a long moment, the morning light continuing its slow climb across the carpet, and Julian found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of his own mother in a hotel lobby 25 years ago, the particular ache of being left somewhere you'd been told was temporary and discovering it wasn't. He understood, looking at Ren now, that whatever else was true about her, she had also once been someone left behind by people who claimed to value her and had spent years since turning that wound into something sharper than grief, something that could finally cut back. "There's another way," Julian said quietly. Everyone in the room turned toward him. "You're right that Annika Kovac deserves the truth," he said, looking at Ren first, then at Imogen. "All of it, not a version curated to protect anyone's legacy. I think that should happen regardless of what you do Monday morning, Ren, regardless of whether a package arrives at the district attorney's office or not. But there's a difference between telling the truth and building a story specifically designed to bury one person while letting yourself walk away clean with 4 years of stolen client fees. If you actually care about justice the way you're claiming to, you don't get to be the only person in this room who pays nothing for what happened to Kovac. And what exactly do you propose? Ren said, watching him carefully now. The truth. All of it. Not your version. Not Imogen's version. Not Augustine's careful 31-year loyalty dressed up as explanation. Everyone's part, laid out together. What Albrecht built, what Imogen inherited and sometimes mismanaged, what happened to Kovac and why, what you've built in parallel and why, what happened to Marcus and to Sarah Whitfield. Annika Kovac gets the truth about her father. The clients currently living under new identities get whatever protection can still reasonably be arranged for them. And everyone who made a choice that cost something, you included, Ren, answers for it honestly, rather than handing the entire weight to whichever person happens to be standing here when the package arrives Monday. That's not how this kind of story usually ends, Ren said, something almost like genuine consideration entering her voice for the first time. Usually somebody walks away clean and somebody else carries everything. Maybe, Julian said. But I'm not interested in being part of a story where the ending depends on who managed to write the better life first. I watched something that looked like a murder in this exact room 2 weeks ago, and it turned out to be a rehearsal for something almost as dishonest, a careful, practiced performance designed to make everyone believe exactly what someone else needed them to believe. I'd like this to end with something true instead, even if true is more complicated and less satisfying for any single one of us. The room held its silence for a long moment, the 4 of them and Ren standing in the soft growing light, and Julian watched something shift, almost imperceptibly, in her posture, the careful performer's stillness she'd carried since they'd stepped off the elevator finally, fractionally, cracking. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's the most I can promise you right now. I have until Monday to decide whether the package still goes out as written, or whether I rewrite it into something closer to what you're describing. She looked at Imogen one last time. For what it's worth, I never wanted to hate you. I think some part of me has been waiting this whole time for a reason not to. She walked past them toward the elevator, unhurried, and none of them moved to stop her. There was nothing, Julian understood, that any of them could have done that would have changed her mind faster than the conversation already had, and trying to physically detain her would only confirm every accusation she'd already built her story around. The elevator doors closed behind her, and the 4 of them stood in the penthouse in silence for a long moment, the harbor visible now through the tall windows, gold morning light spreading slowly across water that had carried away, over 40 years, more quiet reinventions than any of them had fully understood until tonight. The weeks that followed didn't resolve the way Julian might once have hoped a mystery should resolve. Cleanly, with a single villain named and removed, and an institution restored to some imagined former innocence. Instead, what arrived at the district attorney's office that Monday was not the package Ren had originally prepared, but a different one, considerably more complicated, naming everyone, including herself, in language that made no attempt to protect any single person's legacy at the expense of another's. Augustine retired that spring, quietly, without the formal send-off 31 years of service might ordinarily have earned him, choosing instead to spend his final weeks helping investigators understand exactly what had happened the night Frederick Kovac died, and exactly what role he'd played in burying it afterward. He didn't go to prison in the end. The prosecutor, weighing decades of genuinely life-saving work against one catastrophic failure, honestly confessed rather than further concealed, accepted a plea that kept him out of a cell and cost him, instead, everything else he'd built his identity around. Julian visited him twice that summer, in a small apartment near the harbor that smelled, faintly, of the same cedar polish the hotel had always used, and found him both times, sitting by the window with a view of water he could no longer reach by walking through the Aurelian's revolving doors. Imogen resigned the same week, before anyone could formally remove her, and spent the better part of a year working, quietly and without public acknowledgement, to locate and properly compensate every client whose case file showed signs of the same compromised judgment that had cost Kovac his life. She never fully escaped what had happened. There were eventually charges, a long and complicated legal process that ran well past the point where Julian stopped tracking its details closely. But she met all of it without the careful managed composure she'd once used to smooth over difficult truths, choosing instead, for the first time in 13 years, to simply let people see exactly how much it cost her. Annika Kovac received a letter that spring, hand-delivered by Julian himself, containing everything. The truth of her father's final months, his fear, his flawed and human reasons for seeking a way out of a life he built carelessly and then couldn't bear to face the consequences of, and the truth of his death, the actual circumstances, stripped finally of the comfortable fiction that had let her grieve a stranger's version of him for 8 months instead of the real one. She didn't forgive anyone, as far as Julian ever learned, and he didn't think she owed any of them forgiveness. But she wrote back, eventually, a short letter that said only that she was glad, finally, to know what was true, even if true was harder than the story she'd been told. Ren Cabrillo disappeared. In the end, the way she'd always known how to disappear, completely and without a trace, her own name among the few in the final accounting that nobody ever managed to fully track down. Julian thought of her sometimes, standing at the bar in her dark green dress, raising a glass to him with a smile that had known, even then, more about where this would all end than he had. He left the Aurelian that autumn, on a Thursday, the same day of the week that had quietly governed 40 years of careful disappearances before he'd ever known to notice it. He didn't take a new identity, didn't vanish into some carefully constructed alternate life the way so many guests before him had. He simply walked out through the revolving doors at the end of his final shift, into ordinary morning light, carrying nothing more dramatic than a single bag and the particular, hard-won clarity of a man who had spent 11 years learning to be invisible and had finally, in the space of a few extraordinary weeks, learned something more difficult: how to be seen. Priya stayed on, eventually taking the night concierge position herself, and the two of them met for coffee most weeks at a small place near the harbor, trading updates on a story that had stopped, mostly being a mystery, and had become instead simply the complicated history of a building they'd both once believed they understood completely. The Aurelian itself remained standing, exactly as it always had, fog rolling up off the harbor each night to wrap itself around its old stone walls, brass elevators still rising slowly through its dark spine, the lobby pianist still working through the same melancholy songs for an audience that rarely listened closely. Somewhere beneath it, the tunnels Albrecht's father had built for liquor and his daughter's eventual successor had repurposed for something else entirely sat empty now, sealed, Their bare bulbs finally switched off after 93 years of carrying secrets up from the harbor and out into the world. Julian walked past the building sometimes, on his way to somewhere else, and looked up at the 9th-floor stairwell window, the curtain gap finally repaired, the gold light behind it ordinary now, holding nothing more than whatever guest happened to be staying there that week. He no longer needed to wonder what was happening behind that glass. He had learned, finally, after 11 years of watching everyone else's lives from the careful distance of his own profession, exactly what it cost to look closely at something and refuse to look away, and exactly what it was worth, in the end, to choose the truth over the comfortable, well-rehearsed story that would have let everyone, himself included, simply walk away clean.